Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalugin here with a huge week of World War III analysis. One of the biggest, most packed weeks I've encountered in a while. The past few days have just been a cascade of breaking World War III news. Of course, we are going to be breaking down, analyzing all potential realities that could come out of this announced Putin-Trump meeting that will be supposedly occurring on August 15th in the United State of Alaska. That's right, the 50th U.S. state, very close to Russia. The announcement said that, Russia and the U.S. have always been very close neighbors, so it's appropriate to meet in Alaska. Via Ushakov, as well as Witkoff and Trump, they've all announced that this meeting will be taking place. The next week will be dedicated to planning all of the logistics around this meeting, that Trump clearly wants to be the end of the Ukraine war. So we're going to be breaking all of that down, what's going on the front lines, how this corresponds with other negotiations, other powers, how Ukraine, of course, feels about this. And then we are going to be discussing everything going on in Gaza, the new Gaza annexation plan, the sort of middle ground Gaza annexation plan that was approved by Netanyahu and his cabinet and endorsed by Donald Trump in the United States to annex, I believe it's at least a third of Gaza, all of Gaza City. The northern part of the Gaza Strip is about to be completely annexed, ethnically cleansed, occupied by Zionist Jewish forces. So we're going to be breaking all of that down. More and more murders going on in Palestine. The new announcements about the West Bank, the debanking of the Jerusalem Patriarchate, and then, of course, big news in Lebanon is the Lebanese government has decided they will forcibly disarm Hezbollah. Iran is supporting Hezbollah. We're going to be getting into that. The status of Iran's negotiations, their nuclear situation, the Syria situation, the Houthi situation, the Zangezur corridor is going to be something we're talking about here more at the beginning of the show, as the U.S., Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan have all signed this agreement where for 99 years the U.S. will lease a strip of the Zangezur corridor that will allow Turkey to transport goods to Azerbaijan. So Russia has been completely boxed out of this region. This is massive news for World War III, massive news for U.S.-Russia conflict, and most importantly, the future Russo-Turkish conflict, as Turkey is now totally surrounded Russia's southern flank. So we're going to be breaking all of that down. Some other church news, some news from Southeast Asia, some tariff news, a whole bunch of stuff. So again, there's big news about the Trump-Putin summit, sort of didn't catch everyone off guard, but, everyone's so surprised this is happening. A lot of things could change, some things on the battlefield, dramatic things could happen to potentially throw this off. So we're going to be analyzing all of this. But before we hop right in, Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. Another very eventful week, and it's good to sort of follow up on exactly where we left off on episode 129 last week. So very exciting news, I think, for those of us who've been waiting impatiently for a final sort of ceasefire effective talks. Now, it appears that the Turkey-Ankara peace summit talks have fallen through almost entirely, right, at this point. It looks like Trump has taken matters directly into his own hands, and Erdogan has been somewhat pushed away to the sideline, at least temporarily. Now, I'm not saying that there won't be an exchange of documents in the future in either Istanbul or Ankara in the future when the Russian-Ukrainian delegations eventually meet. But at the moment, Conrad, the latest news, as you said, is that Donald J. Trump will meet with President Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin in Alaska, right? Former Russian imperial territory, now one of the states of the United States of America. Very exciting, very great place as well, given some of the first American saints, Orthodox Christian Russian American saints, actually walked on this land. It's very sort of symbolic, and also it's the closest territory, I believe, geographically between, obviously, adjacent to the Russian Federation that America has under its control. So again, a very sort of, I would say, long-awaited, but we have to keep in mind, we are strictly speaking about ceasefire negotiations, ceasefire talks here. This is what the summit is about. It's not necessarily about peace in and of itself. It's not a peace treaty. Now, we have seen countries such as North and South Korea have literally an 80-year ceasefire, right? A stand down. So in a de facto way, that can be seen as a long-term peace plan, but certainly we have to view it very pragmatically. A ceasefire, and even there were Russian analysts, Russian politicians, and I would say even certain Americans that have to face reality that they've stated openly that it's a temporary ceasefire in terms of it will give some breathing room for both parties. And that comes with, of course, its own pros and cons, right? There are these costs associated with the Russians allowing the Ukrainians breathing room, allowing the Ukrainians to recruit, kidnap, draft more soldiers, to train them, to consolidate equipment, and we have to discuss what exactly the speculation around President Putin's meeting with the Talmudic real estate lawyer character from New York, a friend of the Kushners, probably knew the Epstein brothers personally, of course, Donald Trump's longstanding friend. As we discussed with Ryan Dawson on our recent 8th Hour episode, all these strange characters in the real estate game in New York, Manhattan, they're all very shady, all very closely related to Chabad Lubavitch. That is Steve Witkoff. He spoke with Putin for 3 hours. Now, very shady. I would suspect that, for example, President Medvedev, for example, met with a member of the Rothschild family, would be quick to denounce him. However, President Putin meeting with a Talmudic character behind closed doors to discuss ceasefire, we need to take that with a certain note of suspicion, right? Can Witkoff really be trusted here? Remember what he did to Iran earlier, the humiliating, of course, 12-day war, which led to over 1,000 Iranians dead, including many chief generals, IRGC members. And that was, of course, I would say, in a large part facilitated by Steve Witkoff's failed Iran nuclear enrichment peace talks, right? And now we're talking about these ceasefire negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, and Steve Witkoff is the main character here. Again, he doesn't answer to anyone except President Trump personally. He doesn't answer to the Foreign Ministry of the US. He doesn't answer to Rubio, the State Department. He is literally Donald Trump's personal international foreign relations secretary, and with his own sort of staff members below him who answer to him directly. So it's very secretive discussions. Now, we've said before, what could Steve Witkoff have proposed to President Putin to even get him to sit down at the table? Lots of very, I would say, dark and inconspicuous, maybe malicious things. For example, he could have asked President Putin, last week we speculated that, he could have asked Putin to become a negotiator, a middleman between Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel and Hamas, which would be very dangerous for Russia in terms of its geopolitical interests and relations with various very extreme Islamic factions, everything from the extremist, I would say, Hezbollah, Shia, IRGC factions, and of course the Taliban, to the HTS factions, which Russia has recently improved the relations with, and of course the Russian quasi-radical Sunni sects which live in the Northern Caucasus region as well. So Russia getting involved in the Islamic world at the moment, especially with characters from the Zionist sort of geopolitical realm, is incredibly dangerous, especially if blame is shifted onto Russia. Now, the second thing, of course, that would be incredibly horrible is if Witkoff proposed to President Putin to surrender all of his interests in Iran and in that sort of Near East territory to America, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and Israel. Now, that would be, there'd be precedent for this because Russia did exactly the same thing in Libya in 2011. Many people, of course, dispute this, but if you look at the timeline of the Libyan civil war, which commenced in January, February, and of course NATO announced a no-fly zone, Gaddafi was only killed in October 2011, right, when he was entirely defeated, and of course he was assaulted and murdered on the streets in October of 2011. But all the way back in May of 2011, the governments of course, Prime Minister Vladimir Putin and President Medvedev already agreed to recognize the anti-Gaddafi National Transition Council, which was led by radical rebels who aligned against the Gaddafi government. So all the way back in May, so literally 2 months or so removed after the beginning of the civil war in Libya. And of course, need I say anything else about Syria and the recent recognition of HTS? So we have to face the reality that Russia potentially delusionally, and by Russia I mean the Russian government, that is, delusionally pursuing their geopolitical interests in Europe, could, for example, surrender all of their long-term strategic positions as well as potential allies in the Middle East, of course, in favor of the US and Israel. Now, the third consideration, Conrad, that Witkoff may have proposed to President Putin is a lifting of certain sanctions or a transitional incremental lifting of sanctions on Russian politicians, celebrities, the thousands of Russians who have currently been sanctioned, including Putin himself, of the ICC. There being a warrant out for his arrest, and as well as maybe an incremental release of the 300 plus USD billions of dollars that the Russian investments that are frozen in European and American securities, stocks, and other investment funds. So for some reason, they were not withdrawn at the beginning of the SMO by Russia or even before the SMO. And Russia simply has had all these funds frozen, and they haven't been put back into Russia to further develop its economy, its military-industrial complex, and frankly, that is literally the exact same amount of money that the US, under Joe Biden and President Trump, have donated jointly to Ukraine. So there's a certain Talmudic principle of metopia, as described by Nicholas Kozlov in his book Ritual War. It's really almost like Russia is paying for a war against itself in a very strange Talmudic, sort of alchemical way. So I think Steve Witkoff definitely had to have given Putin certain proposals, Conrad. We just don't know what they are. Now, I think the only piece, as we said, the only ceasefire treaty that would somehow satisfy President Putin's reputation, as well as his, shall we say, short to medium-term ambition, would be to grant him at least the full control of Donetsk Oblast, Lugansk Oblast, and a recognition, at least by the U.S., of Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk. I think Zaporia and Kherson, it would be constitutionally sound for the U.S. to, of course, submit and put pressure on Ukraine to surrender those oblasts, as well as Zaporia and Kherson to Russia. However, I think really that's where the hardest negotiating will be. It's around those two particular oblasts and those two cities, because at the moment Russia really hasn't held long-term control over them, and that will be a real surrendering of, shall we say, Zelensky's Ukrainian leverage over to Russia if President Trump really puts pressure on him. But would it be worth, for example, taking Russia out of the Iranian equation entirely to surrender these territories to Putin? Maybe it will be. We'll have to see. But certainly Trump and the American military-industrial complex, the globalists in power in America, have full leverage, of course, over Israel, over Netanyahu, because America literally funds the military in Israel. I think openly we all understand that now, and they have full leverage over Zelensky as well. So we can't really say that the ceasefire in some way depends on Putin. It, in fact, is on the shoulders of President Trump, because he's assumed presidency. Now he has full control over which countries commence which ceasefires, really. And I think Trump at the moment, that's why President Putin's meeting with Trump as well, Connor, because Trump is really the man behind the scenes. He's the guy behind the curtain. Of course, there's someone even behind Trump, like Lutnick in a lot of these clips, right? But at the moment, it does appear that this is the real deal. This is the first openly, maybe first proper step towards a ceasefire agreement between Russia and Ukraine that we've seen over the last 3 years.
No, this is a massive development. This is pretty much the biggest development in the negotiation sphere of the Russia-Ukraine war since Boris Johnson, blew up the previous Istanbul agreements that were occurring in the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion. But I think the most relevant quote from what Trump has said so far about the negotiations is here. He says, "You're looking at territory that's been fought over for 3.5 years. A lot of Russians have died, a lot of Ukrainians. So we're looking at that. But we're actually going to get some back and some swapping. It's complicated. It's actually nothing easy. It's very complicated. But we're going to get some back and we're going to get some switched," Trump said. "There'll be some swapping of territories to the betterment of both, but we'll be talking about that either later or tomorrow or whatever," he said. He said at the time he will announce location in a little while, but insisted he didn't want to, as he hosted the Armenian and Azerbaijan leaders to sign a peace agreement. We're going to get into that in a second. Obviously, it's in Alaska. We don't have the specific city that's been announced. I don't know if it's going to be on Attu or on some island close to Russia, or if it's going to be in Anchorage or Juneau or Fairbanks near the North Pole. I mean, who knows, right? It could be all sorts of different places. But I think the real, of course, story is going to be this next week as this unfolds. I don't know how much is going to be announced. Of course, we remember what happened in the 12-day war when Trump announced the ceasefire between Israel and Iran. He really didn't like when Israel, for those past, few hours before the ceasefire went into effect, they went all out and just went full scorched earth on Iran. I'm wondering if the fact that this has even been agreed to is going to lead to some changes. I don't know if the Russians are going to be rapidly pushing to secure whatever they can before the agreement, or if because of this, in a show of goodwill, they're going to be not having a ceasefire, but sort of toning things down, not making any dramatic operations, no dramatic missile strikes on these cities. But again, I guess just to give the people what they want, obviously Dmitry should probably fill us in on a bit of the frontline updates. Of course, Pokrovsk is very close to being completely taken. Zaporia, they're less than 10 kilometers outside of Zaporia itself. The Kherson region, of course, everyone is just waiting across the river for the order to do something. So I guess, unless you want to give us any other frontline updates, Dmitry, what is going to happen here? I mean, obviously, I think my initial thought was Putin sees a chance to get Zaporia, Kherson, these two major cities that are already considered part of Russia, back without significant bloodshed, and I think he wants to take it. But based on Trump's statements, it seems he's implying there will be other territories that'll be given up. And again, with the exception of, Kaliningrad, Königsberg, and maybe something to do with Transnistria, Pridnestrovia, I don't know what Russia has to give up that wouldn't be an egregious betrayal of the people living in these regions, the Russian people that have supported this war effort for so long, and most importantly, the troops that have died for this special military operation. That the fact that it's still even called a special military operation is pretty embarrassing. You should give these people, these fallen people, the respect of calling it what it is, which is a very bloody modern industrial war. And I think when we're all thinking about how this is going to go down, this is all in the context of these tariffs that were supposed to go on to India and China. India claiming, Reuters was claiming that India and U.S. trade relations were about to hit rock bottom, that India was going to start withdrawing from a lot of these defense agreements they have with the United States and fully start pivoting towards Russia. China has indicated that will also be what they are doing. However, the Indian government itself sort of rejected that Reuters report, but much like what we're going to discuss here in a second with the Zangezur corridor, it doesn't really matter what these governments say. When the U.S. and their media outlets start about these things, those are more trustworthy reports, because the Armenians tried to deny they were selling the Zangezur corridor to the U.S., and here we are. We're going to talk about that in 1 second. But I guess you can give us a bit of a frontline report, Dmitry, and what exactly you think. No ifs, ands, or buts. All angles are open. Anything is possible. What do you genuinely think is going to happen after you give us that analysis?
No, of course, I completely agree, Conrad. Look, it's not possible for Russia to give up any of its territories that have already been under its control for a long period of time. Clearly, Kherson and Zaporia have not been, and so I think there's potential that President Putin may actually stand down on those particular cities. But there are territories which Russia controlled, which are constitutionally, as well as I would say, even according to some claims, clearly buffer zones. That is zones, territories which Russia will trade to Ukraine, right? I'll mention a few of these. For example, and one of them, of course, is technically in the Zaporia Oblast, but that's the Zaporia nuclear power plant, right? Which we've discussed since the beginning of the war. There was massive fears of Ukrainians basically negligently sabotaging this plant, creating a Chernobyl 2.0 in the center of Ukraine, causing immense nuclear fallout. This particular nuclear power plant is required to, of course, not just energize the mining as well as industrial operations around the power plant itself and all those central Ukrainian regions, but the two major cities, Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk, right? Dnipro itself, which is one of the capitals of Chabad-Lubavitch, the Talmudic centers in Ukraine, aka New Jerusalem, New Heavenly Jerusalem, or however they like to call it, right? The center of New area. So that particular nuclear power plant, as well as Energograd, the particular town associated with the nuclear power plant, I believe the Ukrainians will try to negotiate through Trump into their own control in order for them to have some sort of control over the energy, right? Now that clearly goes against the Russian constitutional considerations, but I think if they propose a lifting of certain financial sanctions for the Russians, maybe the Russians will be down to have those discussions. I'm not making any judgments as to how effective this will be. I personally think that would be a betrayal of Russian interests in the long term, clearly. However, this entire special military operation has been there's been a lot of questionable points, shall we say. So I'll mention the next few territories which I think Russia will clearly surrender to Ukraine. And these are very obviously the buffer zones in Sumskaya Oblast, right? Clearly, all those villages and the territories which Russia has taken over the last few months after kicking the Ukrainians officially out of the Kurskaya Oblasts. So all of those territories will be, of course, ceded to Ukraine. Then moving further east, of course, we have the city of Volchansk, as well as that massive highway that the Ukrainians have invested in the years prior to the special military operation, leading to Kharkov and then further on to Kiev. Volchansk will be liberated. The northern areas of the Kharkovskaya Oblast will be, of course, ceded to Ukraine, according to this agreement. Liman, Kupiansk, which are located to the east, of course, adjacent to Lugansk, Donetskaya Oblast, right? These particular cities, which are so key. Again, they lead to Izum, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, Kupiansk and Liman. These, especially Kupiansk, I think, being in Kharkovskaya Oblast to its east, it'll be turned by the Ukrainians into this vanguard fortress against the Russians, against any future incursions. And it definitely will be completely sieged. I mean, it's literally in Ukrainian control now, but the Russians will leave the outskirts of Kupiansk, I think, according to this particular treaty. So I think the main discussions, Conrad, will be around the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia. They'll be about the Dnipro border, of course, along the Khersonskaya Oblast, and generally just about those buffer zones. I think the Ukrainians, the most painful aspect of surrendering territory to the Russians will be the Donetsk Oblast, which the Ukrainians have invested literally at least 1 million the lives of at least 1 million troops into since 2014, This is the fighting. Ukraine has been doing intense fighting in Donetsk, in their controlled Donetsk Oblast for so long. There are graves everywhere. Ukrainian Russian blood has been spilled on this land for very vague geopolitical reasons for a long time now. It would be very painful for Zelensky and his administration. In fact, Zelensky may lose all support of the Azov battalion, the right-wing battalions, Aidar, and all these other, which literally they're named after, and they've had bases in the Donetsk Oblast for so long. And if all of that is surrendered to the Russians, right, Izium, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, of course, all of Pokrovsk, what will exactly happen? I think you'll probably see an overthrowing of the Zelensky government, maybe a returning of Poroshenko to power. Because remember, Poroshenko in some ways will come out as this strongman character who actually held a lot of the Donetsk Oblast in control, right? Because he's the one under whom there's been significant progression in contravening the Minsk agreements, correct? So Poroshenko will look as this like this victorious previous golden age of Ukrainian sovereignty character, and Zelensky will look like the loser who lost all this territory to Russia. As well as you might have Valery Zaluzhny return from his short stay as the ambassador to the UK and run for the presidency as well. Arestovich, of course, has stated that Ukraine has basically lost all of its sovereignty given all the debts that it's accrued over the last, and of course the land being sold to BlackRock and all these other machinations, economically speaking, that it's been engaged in. However, I think Ukraine having all the weapons under its personal control, yes, there are NATO, for example, NATO statespeople and officers in charge of many of these military installations in Ukraine, but the actual physical Ukrainians, just like the Taliban and the Mujahideen, which the US funded in Afghanistan, the people on the ground are actually Ukrainian radicals, Ukrainian Banderite extremists. They're the ones with the M4s, the AK-47s. They're the ones who actually have the weapons in their hands. And we know that in the past, regimes which America, for example, and the West has funded, they've sometimes gone out of control, even, I would say, ISIS to that extent. So there can be something said to the fact that the Ukrainians will simply follow their own local, maybe gangster mafia-like interests, and they won't necessarily follow even a Minsk-free proposal created by Putin and Trump in Alaska. Even if Zelensky does sign a ceasefire, Conrad, it may mean that there will be local firefights and maybe localized drone terrorist acts across the entire border, wherever that border line is drawn. So I don't mean to say that the bloodshed will entirely end. It won't. And we know for sure, definitely, that the ceasefire, however long supposedly it'll last, with, of course, an opportunity for it to be renovated and extended, will be a large potential for the ceasefire to lead to even a more bloody conflict in the future. Because we know, and I think if this isn't mentioned at the Alaska peace talks, the liberty and the independence of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the ability of the church to function without persecution, and of course the protection of Russian culture and the Russian heritage in the lands which will remain under the control of Kiev, this will be crucial in order to secure a sort of future without, I would say, extenuous conflicts in this Eastern European landscape, because otherwise Russians will always have a pretext and even, I would say, a moral right to militarily intervene in Ukraine once again and recommence military action, which again will lead to most likely a second special military operation sometime in the near future. So that's, I think, the prospects. You'll have those buffer zones handed over to Ukraine, which Russia obviously has captured for leverage. I think Energograd, however they call it, with the nuclear power plant in Zaporia, most likely will be handed over to Ukraine or even leased to Ukraine in some sort of weird way, but the Ukrainians certainly will take control over it. And I think the Russians will most likely take absolutely the entire Donetsk Oblast, if not a large portion of it, including all those strongholds and defensive positions which the Ukrainians have been building since literally 2014. That will be a huge moral loss for Zelensky. He won't be able to get away and explain this. However, I do have to mention the possibility of Zelensky potentially escaping consequences, because we've seen Pashinyan literally oversee the exodus of 100,000 asylum seekers of Armenian origin out of Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, and Pashinyan is still in power. He hasn't been lynched, he hasn't been dealt with or brought to justice for literally betraying the interests of his own people. He lost the war and he claimed, we lost Artsakh, but we gained our sovereignty. Zelensky may try to play something of that sort. But just like Saakashvili in Georgia when he lost the 5-day war and shortly thereafter lost power in Georgia, I think we may see a similar consequence for Zelensky if these these ceasefire / quasi-peace talks don't go in his favor. So I think prospectively, looking into the future, we do need to mention that this solution will not be long-standing, right? I know it sounds like a lot of people are saying, well, we just want the bloodshed, the brotherly war to end. But this is not, ceasefire talks like this are not going to put an end to the conflict which commenced in 2013 and 14. And even I would say before that, when the Bolsheviks created Ukrainianism and started Ukrainianizing the population. And of course, this extended throughout the Soviet regime and clearly was exacerbated by the independence of Ukraine at the Belovezhskaya Pushcha, 8th of December 1991 agreements, which Boris Yeltsin treasonously signed with, of course, Ukraine separating from Velika Russia, so Greater Russia, the Russian Federation in the future. So very clear, and I think I agree with Strelkov's analysis, Conrad, that any temporary ceasefire agreements, the only way in which they would benefit Russia is if, and this is only Putin and I think maybe Andrei Belousov would know the truth behind this, is if the Russian military-industrial complex is suffering right now because of corruption internally, because of ineptitude, negligence, basically sabotage. If Russia is not capable of leading the special military operation to take Nikolaev, Odessa, Kharkov, even Kiev, to further expand, then there can be no talk of pushing the war further. If the Russia is not capable of fighting a war to retake or liberate all of Ukraine, then of course a ceasefire will be in Russia's benefit. But we don't know this because Russia needs to put on a strong face to the external world. However, judging by what's happening on the ground, general progress into Pokrovsk, for example, which I'll discuss in a little moment, Russia is making incremental gains, but we haven't seen any incredible takings of land, just as, for example, the Ukrainians tried to do in Kursk.
Yeah, I think at this point, unfortunately, and we just have to be honest, the reality of this being agreed to, even in any capacity, shows that the Russians clearly were not actually ever going to truly aim for Nikolaev, Odessa, some of these other places, because right now, that's now just completely off the table. They're going to be lucky if they get Kherson and Zaporia without losing significant other territories. And we've got to, game all of this out. What else could Russia give up? Trump's openly talking about the swapping of territories. So, my other fears I'm going to get into in a second about diplomacy in the Middle East and these other things that Russia influences that the U.S. would like to be changed. But, again, they're not going to give up the Kaliningrad Oblast. They're not going to give up, obviously, the Donbass. And you said, right, Dmitry, 100% they're going to give up Sumy, Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkov, whatever they have occupied in these regions. That's not debatable. And then what else is there to even give up? They could give up the Kuril Islands. They could give those to Japan. They could... I don't even know. They could, again, Pridnestrovia, Transnistria, they could give that to the Moldovan government, completely, order the troops out. So, these are these are options, but whether Trump would accept those as, giving them what they want, maybe if Putin gives up the Kuril Islands and Pridnestrovia, maybe they'll give him other things that they haven't even already taken militarily. All sorts of options are here. I guess in theory, there's a small chance that this somehow goes well for the Russians, but again, they probably needed to take more militarily. This is what we had been saying for a while. We had always said that they need to secure all of the constitutionally recognized oblasts on the military basis and then push further so they can achieve, further things in negotiations, more promises, more demilitarizations. And of course, this comes into the question with Belarus as well. Who knows? Lukashenko has said he's not going to be running for re-election. We had that recent law where there's going to be, you can run for office in both countries, Russia and Belarus. So we're probably looking at within 5 years, total Russian-Belarusian integration. The question, will this have anything to do with, these negotiations? And I think what everyone's really scared of as well, and I think this is lurking under the surface, no one's been talking about it too much yet, but I'm sure they will in the coming weeks, is will Russia be pressured into betraying Iran? Will Russia be pressured into supporting Israel even further? Because think about this. What does this come right afterwards and on the heels of? Russia and Putin and Netanyahu have been talking on the phone extensively. Putin, Netanyahu, and Trump have sort of been playing telephone with each other as Putin attempts, I think, to sort of build rapport with Netanyahu because he knows Netanyahu and Israel obviously have extreme influence over the United States. So all of this, unfortunately, is not good. We saw Erdogan about to visit Kiev, which again, Turkey ostensibly right now an enemy of Israel. So in a bizarre way right now, Ukraine perhaps isn't on the best front with Israel, as Israel knows that Russia and the U.S. are the two most powerful players that actually need to be courted, that have influence in the region. Due to Russia's influence over Iran and due to the United States' influence over, every other Arab country in the region. So that's what's going on. My fear is basically behind the scenes if Putin, promises that he will effectively abandon Iran, not support them, not further support, their nuclearization, their enrichment, that he will sort of get guarantees that, unlike Minsk 1 and 2, this Alaska agreement, whatever it is, will, actually be held to. It won't just be, words that the U.S. then secretly builds up the Ukrainian forces. And again, it leads to SMO2. Unfortunately, as you said, Dmitry, I fear if they don't secure the entire Black Sea coast, we're just kicking the can down the road, as we have said on the show a million times. And we're going to get into Strelkov's perspective here in a second. But the other part of Trump's statements, the actual ceasefire, ironically enough, Trump doesn't seem to be concerning himself with them. He says now President Zelensky has to get all of everything he needs because he's going to have to get ready to sign something. And I think he's working hard to get that done. Trump punted to Zelensky to prepare to sign the ceasefire agreement. Obviously, I think this is also happening amidst these recent polls coming out that 69% of Ukrainians want negotiated end to war as soon as possible. Only 24% of Ukrainians want to keep fighting, a new complete reversal of public opinion since 2022. This is from Anti-War. Gallup released a new poll on Thursday, 69%, like I just said. So huge shifts over the past few years as Ukrainians more and more are dying. Right now, it says just 16% of Ukrainians approve of the performance of U.S. leadership compared to 66% in 2022. But the majority of Ukrainians, 70%, still believe the U.S. needs to play a role in peace talks. And again, ultimately, this serves Russia's benefit as well, because the more land Russia takes, as it's clear that they want the war to end more and more, that means people would be more and more willing to give up land, have the war ended. And so the fact that Trump made it so clear that there would be swapping, this is very, very big news. And I just want to read the TASS readout here from Ushakov and what he said. It sort of presents the Russian perspective. This says, in the coming days, Moscow and Washington will, of course, devote themselves to the most active and intense work on the practical and political parameters of the Alaska summit. It will be a difficult process, but we will work on it actively and intensely. This is from Yuri Ushakov. Earlier, Trump had said he hoped to meet with his Russian counterpart in Alaska on August 15th. The U.S. president made his announcement on his Truth Social page. This will be their first face-to-face meeting since Trump returned to the White House in January 2025. And of course, this is the first time Putin has even made it to the United States since 2015. So first time in a decade that he's setting foot on U.S. soil, and it's not even the continental U.S. So very, very interesting developments. Again, I think we all are intensely curious as to what Steve Witkoff potentially said to Putin, what Putin potentially said back to Steve Witkoff. So very, very interesting times indeed. I'd like to hear whatever other pieces of analysis you may have on this, Dmitry. I guess there's the whole North Korea card. Russia sort of has that. The U.S. may try to lean on them to pressure North Korea to just, in general, just back down from its doing whatever it does. So, I mean, there's the China perspective. There's so many, behind the scenes diplomatic things that that Russia could concede upon. But again, Trump made it clear there's going to be map redrawing and swapping, which could mean anything. So if you have any final thoughts on those negotiations, Dmitry, yes, let us know about the frontline battle situation. And then we also need to talk about Russia getting pushed out of the Caucasus with this new Zangezur corridor deal.
No, absolutely. I think the last few points that I wanted to make was, firstly, there's a certain urgency that I can see from Donald J. Trump. The 10, 12-day proposal that he said, this is the deadline. It's actually come to pass already, right? So 8th, 9th of August, we've already met the deadline of Donald J. Trump. And I think this 3-hour Steve Witkoff discussion was Russia coming to the table. But the interesting point is that Putin actually respected Trump's deadline to some point, and he actually spoke to Steve Witkoff for 3 hours. So that means that perhaps Russia, to some extent, was wary of and at least somewhat concerned about what Trump could potentially propose in terms of sanctions or further tariffs on its partners, overseas, for example, BRICS countries like China and, of course, India. Now, China is very questionable as to if the U.S. would ever place large tariffs on China, because that would crash the entire world economy. However, India is a different story, right? Obviously, India is still the world's most populated nation. And I think something that speaks to the concerns that Russia did have is that President Putin received a telephone call, I believe, from Modi, the Prime Minister of India, shortly after the 3-hour Witkoff discussion. So that telephone call was clearly that Modi was like, hey, are we going to be tariffed or sanctioned by the US or not? Right, so Modi's clearly concerned. India and Russia have warm relations, obviously, for BRICS and trading, and India buying Russian weaponry, for example. Unlike the Southern Caucasus countries, mind you, Georgia, Azerbaijan, they all use NATO/US weapons and equipment now. At least since the early 2000s, they've been transitioning from Soviet arms to American NATO arms. So just keep that in mind. So, but India has always been purchasing Russian equipment and Chinese equipment as well. So that's very key. So Modi clearly is concerned. Putin reassured him. He's like, look, so Putin has obligations not just to the Russian people, but to other nation states and other sovereign countries. This is, again, problematic in terms of maybe he should be concerned about Russian interests first. However, Russian interests are also contingent on exactly which countries Russia will trade with in the near future. This will economically potentially benefit Russia's citizens, and Putin, of course, is a public servant at the end of the day. And the other interesting thing is that Putin personally called, after receiving that call from Modi, he called the leaders of China, Belarus, and Lukashenko made a social media post or like a press release post where he said that the Russo-Ukrainian war will once again forever end very soon. He made essentially this prediction that maybe Russia and Ukraine will never ever fight again because of what's coming. And so Lukashenko has I think it's almost like retirement type statements, as you said, Conrad. He said he won't be running for re-election. He said that there won't be a conflict any further. I think he's getting a little bit tired and wary of all this very hardcore tension that's been taking place surrounding Belarus and surrounding himself, his legacy as the successful president of Belarus. We'll be completely honest about that. And he wants to end it on a good note because he is getting up there in age. And he has served the Belarusian people for over 30 years at this point. I think closing in on like 32 years, if not that. So that's an incredible long presidency, longer than the reign of most emperors and kings. So, longer than Tsar Nicholas II's reign, that's for sure. It's very interesting how Lukashenko views all of this, but Putin also called the president of Uzbekistan and he called Tokayev the president of Kazakhstan. So that's very key. So there are Putin's making certain guarantees after speaking to Witkoff to all these countries and especially these BRICS nations, maybe proclaiming that, look, Russia has stabilized, the economic situation we're doing well. It's almost like a business conversation with certain networking stakeholders, right? So he's almost guaranteeing that, look, we're actually going to end what's happening right now. We're moving on to, successful peace talks that you don't have to, or the ceasefire talks for that matter. You won't have to be concerned about further tariffs or anything of that sort. Because remember, Trump could have tariffed and sanctioned Kazakhstan as well. Well, because we speak about India, but the Central Asian countries could have all been tariffed and sanctioned by Trump if the proposed deadline wasn't met. Now, the big PR victory, as I said, was Pokrovsk, because the Russians have basically entered into the center of Pokrovsk, and they've spearheaded this strike through the southwestern portion. So they've, of course, secured a very large proportion of the city in the middle of it. However, the Ukrainians still hold massive strongholds. Pokrovsk, as described by both Russians and Ukrainians on the front lines, it looks like something out of Silent Hill or Resident Evil. It looks very post-apocalyptic. So basically, troops only move along the streets at nighttime, right? They use night vision. Now, I doubt that the Russians and Ukrainians have access to this American top-level night vision gear, which can cost upwards of $50,000 American dollars just for a pair of goggles with incredible night vision, a huge spectrum of view, etc. But they do have night vision equipment. Moving around at night is a lot safer. During the day, there's massive drone battles. There's, of course, battles in tunnels, underground parking lots. It's a really bloody front of the war at the moment in Pokrovsk. And the Russians are doing something else, very key. The Russians have taken the railroad that leads out of Pokrovsk. They completely control it. However, there's still at least one freeway/highway that leads out of Pokrovsk, which will allow the Ukrainians, as I said last week, to still retreat out of that major key city, which will essentially give the Russians an Avdiivka-type victory. Now, one more thing I want to note about Pokrovsk is that the Russians are also wrapping around from the northeast. It's very key. There's a small city town called Radinskaya. Now, Radinskaya, and the Ukrainians call it something else. It's a mining town. So even on the crest of the city, you see these two mining hammers, and it's a coal mining town. There are coal mines on the eastern side of the city. Russians have actually begun assaulting, and I think they captured one of the two of the main coal mines located there. So we're talking about underground tunnel battles, in the dark. It's incredible. Once they take Radzinskaya, they'll be able to access Pokrovsk from the northeast, and they're going to be potentially even targeting that last highway, freeway leading out of Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk will be effectively surrounded. So Russians are making headway in Radzinskaya, which is located 1, if not 2 kilometers northeast of Pokrovsk. So in fact, the Pokrovsk situation is looking really bad. As soon as the Russians take it, not only will you see demoralization of the Ukraine in the media, domestically as well as internationally, but for the Russians, it'll be a huge boon to their victory. Morale will increase, and clearly Putin will, have more leverage in these future discussions with not just Donald J. Trump, but also potentially Zelensky. So we're looking at huge Russian gains geopolitically, like on the ground. And of course, as we're speaking about frontline fighting, there's constant drone warfare in the air, up to 50 drones shot down by either side every single day, and hundreds of drones launched every single day. So if you just consider the scale of fighting, it's quite immense. Again, I doubt that there are, as Ukrainians and certain, I would say even pro-Russian sources claim that there are 1 million losses of lives. I doubt that's the case, but we're looking at least, to date, 200, if not 300,000 Ukrainian servicemen killed, and perhaps upwards of 100,000 Russian troops and servicemen slain in battle. Minimum 50,000, which is still a gigantic army. In the ancient days, this would be like the entire army of Alexander the Great killed in combat. So these are huge numbers of brave Russian / brainwashed Russian Ukrainian warriors who've fallen for, it appears to be very small amounts of land somewhere in which, again, need to be economically exploited. But how much money are these lives even worth? What exactly is taking place? I mean, maybe if there's a ceasefire announced, Conrad, we can finally sort of tally up the results of this SMO and what exactly it has reached, the temporary goals. But nevertheless, it is a very bloody affair. And at the moment, Pokrovsk is in the center of it all. If the Russians take it, Putin will gain a huge, I would say, PR victory for himself and his regime. And clearly, Ukraine will lose a lot of reputation worldwide as well as domestically. It may spell even the end of Zelensky's presidency, which has already been kind of walking a very fine line.
Yes, I think, again, who knows what this summit is even going to look like? Who knows what other side meetings will be involved when all of this happens? Who knows? Again, I mean, there was talk about infrastructure. I mean, who knows, right? I've talked for years about how, if the Jews in the West hadn't funded the Russian Revolution and the empire had persisted and the U.S. had continued and they had been allies, we could already have a highway connecting the United States and Russia, and you could drive to Europe and Asia by now, right? But, people had different plans for what they wanted to use, our human capital for. But, in the midst of all of this, again, Belarus and Russia growing closer together. The question I think a lot of it is going to become is how are the people on the ground going to react to this? How are the Russian citizens in these occupied territories going to react? How are people that are close to the Russian front lines going to react? How are the Ukrainians in Odessa and these other places going to react to this? You mentioned, Voltsman, Poroshenko potentially taking power, despite the fact that clearly about 70% of people want to end the war. Those people are likely, as you mentioned, Dmitry, not the ones with the guns. That's Azov Battalion, Aidar Battalion, these other groups that, again, who knows what they're going to get up to? Who knows if the U.S. is going to have to go in to take those people out, not necessarily to go against Russian forces, but to peacekeep, against that. And again, who knows if there's going to be the conditions for elections in Ukraine? I mean, Trump said Zelensky's going to be forced to sign a deal. He's sort of having to come to terms with it. I wouldn't be surprised if that includes, some sort of elections that are supposed to happen imminently before even the end of the year. But as we transfer here to talking about the Zangezur corridor, it's important to remember that in the past week, Azerbaijan openly started producing mass amounts of shells and artillery for Ukraine. So the Turkish Azeri sort of pivot towards Ukraine in this war has been continuing. I don't know if that represents, sort of Israel playing both sides, as Israel itself courts Russia and their proxies in Azerbaijan sort of supply Ukraine with what they need. I don't really know what the angle is there, but I'm going to read from the latest here because the big meeting occurred between Aliyev and Pashinyan with Trump sitting in the middle there. We had a beardless Pashinyan, weird-ass looking individual. But this is from Yahoo News. It says the leaders of Azerbaijan and Armenia signed an agreement aimed at ending decades of conflict as they were hosted by President Donald Trump at the White House on Friday. Azerbaijan's President Ilham Aliyev and Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan shook hands after the U.S. president described the events as historic. It's been a long time coming, Trump said of the agreement, which will reopen some key transport routes between the countries and increase U.S. influence in the region. Azerbaijan and Armenia fought over Nagorno-Karabakh, an ethnically Armenian enclave in Azerbaijan, in the 1980s and 90s, and violence has flared up in the years since. On Friday, Trump said Armenia and Azerbaijan had promised to stop all fighting forever, as well as open up travel, business, and diplomatic relations. We are today establishing peace in the Caucasus, Aliyev said. We lost a lot of years being preoccupied with wars and occupation and bloodshed. Pashinyan called the signing a significant milestone in relations between the two countries. 35 years they fought, and now they're friends, and they're going to be friends for a long time, Trump said at the event. The White House said that as part of the deal, the U.S. will also help build a major transit corridor that will be named the Trump Route for international peace and prosperity. The route will connect Azerbaijan and its autonomous Nakhchivan exclave, which are separated by Armenian territory. In the past, Aliyev has demanded that Armenia give his country a railroad corridor to Nakhchivan. Armenia wanted to have control over the road, and the Azerbaijani leader has in the past threatened to take the corridor by force. The issue has halted and stalled previous peace negotiations. Both leaders praised Trump and his team throughout the meeting. President Trump in 6 months did a miracle, Aliyev said. Trump said he had also signed a bilateral agreement with both countries to expand energy and technology trade. Trump has sought to make peace deals between several warring countries during his second term. This goes on here to talk about the potential Putin-Trump meeting. So again, this is a huge deal because the Nakhchivan exclave is the only part of Azerbaijan that borders Turkey, just on a tiny little sliver of land. They've got a big highway that gets them over there. So again, after this is signed and Turkey, gains access to this, if the U.S. and Turkey and NATO ever want, they can send troops, energy, missiles, infrastructure, anything over this rail line and these highways that they're going to build. They can send it to Azerbaijan to go all across the Caspian Sea, all the way up to the Chinese border if they wanted, with these Turkic-influenced countries. So this is a massive deal. Again, this was announced. We actually talked about this in previous episodes. The Armenians tried to deny it because obviously Pashinyan has completely sold out the Armenian people here. I'm surprised there aren't mass protests going on in Armenia. The Russians, of course, had long decided they wanted to side with Azerbaijan for stupid reasons. And yet here we are. I know Strelkov has spoken about a lot of these events recently, and he was one of the ones years ago, along with us, one of the people warning about the Turkish, Azerbaijani, Israeli sort of axis. And unfortunately, his warnings just go unheeded. It seems that they explicitly did the opposite of what he would have prescribed. So this is a huge deal. We've been talking about the Zangezur corridor on the show for a very long time. Obviously, this coming amidst Azerbaijan increasing their supplies towards Ukraine. That might be a reason why the U.S., clearly signed this deal that benefits Azerbaijan much more than Armenia. I'm still not sure what Armenia gets out of this besides some paltry, trade technology agreement that Azerbaijan also got with the United States. So, this is, the headlines of people that actually are in the know are all Russia kicked out of the Caucasus, which this is exactly what this is. And frankly, if it wasn't for Georgia's recent pivot, which is by no means complete, and they're no means allies with Russia yet, and there have been by no means any actual real diplomatic moves towards reconciling with the Russians and the Georgians. They're just generally on the same page, and the Georgians have totally rejected the West and NATO. Besides that, Russia is totally lost in this region. And on top of all of this, this is putting literally a U.S. Turkish aligned private military contracting, private industrial contracting zone on Iran's border, directly on the Iranian border. So whether Iran, who again, this all comes amidst Pezeshkian, who's Azerbaijani himself, trying to soften Iranian-Azeri relations, are the Iranians who are historically an ally of Armenia, how is that going to work out? There's so many questions here, and the U.S. knows they just got a stunningly huge victory, and Putin needs to really take this into account when he goes to these negotiations and when they have this Alaska summit, because as much as you're trying to give things up and act like, oh, this is peace, this is whatever, America, NATO, Turkey, your civilizational geopolitical enemies, I'm talking to you, Vladimir Putin, just achieved a major victory strategically against you in the chessboard. They are putting you in check, as it were. And if you don't respond, you're going to be in some very hot waters. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Dimitri, as well as, what Strelkov has said about this situation. And you already said the Istanbul, Ankara, all those negotiations fell through, but the Russians really need to be aware of this Turkish issue or it's going to sneak up on them.
No, absolutely. It's really concerning what's happening in the Turkic world. We cover it, I think, correctly so with all the required detail, because just as with the Israeli-Iranian conflict, which spilled over into the 12-day war in June, we were basically anticipating and building up to it by covering exactly all the news stories related to that particular conflict before it even took place. So it's very correct that we cover exactly what's happening in these Southern Caucasus lands with all due accuracy and detail. But I do need to note two particular meetings that have taken place in Azerbaijan in recent months, which have received almost no coverage, but let's just discuss them here today. So just this week, or in the last 14 days to be correct, on the 6th of August, hundreds of European rabbis, so heads of various rabbinic cults, Chabad Lubavitch included, met up in Baku, Azerbaijan for a conference. So this is like a World Jewish Conference in relation to the Abraham Accords. So Baku hosted hundreds of rabbis, Talmudic rabbis from around the world. Now, in early July, a secret clandestine meeting took place as well, but this time it wasn't of Talmudic rabbis. It was the heads of basically almost all European Masonic lodges, including the Russian and the Azerbaijan Masonic lodges. The Russian lodge, of course, led by Andrei Bogdanov, who was a half Russian, half Tatar. I mean, physically, he looks somewhat ethnic, perhaps maybe more than a Tatar, I would say. Maybe there is some Turkic in him as well. He looks like a quasi-Azeri, but he's the leader of the Russian Freemasonic lodges, right? So keep this in mind. Russia still has Freemasons, and the Freemasons are meeting in Baku, of all places. This happened in early July, right? Sort of a precursor. So not only, we can speak about maybe a Talmudic Masonic conspiracy here. It's not necessarily a conspiracy. It's just that Aliyev is happy to host Wahhabis, Freemasons, Talmudic rabbis, and NATO officials, Turkic World officials, and everyone in between in order to meet his particular goals. A very flexible character indeed. And I completely agree with you, Conrad, that Azerbaijan, it's obviously, I have family in Azerbaijan as well, so I have direct ties. I don't want to mention exactly where they work, but they work in the oil industry there. They've lived there for over 100 years. And it's very key to understand, like Azerbaijan, unfortunately has been one of the access points of the West to the Caspian Sea. And I think it remains to be so today. The only thing that's missing, Conrad, is a NATO port on the Caspian borders, which again will threaten potentially the north of Iran. Azerbaijan is the only country that can provide NATO access. Now that, of course, Georgia is really out of the picture for, generally speaking, as a NATO base, even on the Black Sea, because again, Georgia has somewhat pivoted away from the Eurocentric positioning that it's been sort of leaning towards since the times of Saakashvili. So it's a very positive development in Georgia, but Azerbaijan, we can't say the same, nor can we say the same for Armenia, which is a landlocked country. And generally speaking, now it'll be completely subjugated, as it has been historically for over 1,000 years, to neighboring superpowers. More than 1,000, I would say 2,000 years since the time of Tigranes the Great and the Great King Mithridates Eupator. So for a very long time, Armenia has not really had proper sovereignty and independence since the time of the Roman conquests. And unfortunately, Pashinyan is not the one who's going to grant it what exactly the Armenian nationalists are seeking. So we have to just keep this in mind. I think, Conrad, it's very curious to see how Erdogan, if he's the man really behind the scenes leading all of this, a lot of speculation that, he's a very skilled politician. Is he the one pulling the strings, or is it in fact Aliyev or some sort of mountain Jew clans who are organizing all of these Turkic World with the alliance with Israel and the Chabad rabbis and Freemasons to unite all these powers into one particular belt, maybe connected to China, creating this new Silk Road leading from China to Europe, and of course securing that immense trade and all those benefits for the Turkic countries. Who knows? I mean, the Khazarians, mind you, as we discussed with Dr. David Patrick Harry, they were a Turkic nomadic people whose elites converted to Talmudic Judaism in the 7th, 8th century AD. So it's not the first time we've seen this alliance really work and produce, maybe poisonous fruits for its neighbors. And just an interesting point regarding the Turkic world, Russia, one of Russia's only real influences over the Turkic world, that is in Moldova. We've spoken about this particular enclave of Gagazians, right? There's a few 100,000 Gagazians, maybe tens of thousands at most, living in Moldova. So that's bordering the Odessa Oblast and bordering Pridnestrovia, Transnistria, which Russia has huge influence over. Now, Gagazians are an Orthodox Christian, mind you, Russian Orthodox Christian, not Romanian Orthodox Christian, Turkic minority who, there's theories about who they descend from, but potentially some sort of allied people to the Ottoman Empire back in the day who converted to Orthodoxy very early on, and they remain living in the sort of southeastern part of modern-day Moldova. So adjacent to Romania, adjacent to the Odessa Oblast, which is that key, most lucrative oblast of all of Ukraine, this province, which allows Ukraine to ship grain as well as fertilizer and all the other goods to the rest of the world through the Black Sea and through the Bosphorus Straits. So very important oblasts, which the Russians had immense influence over. Now, the governor of Gagauzia, this little, not even an autonomous, but simply just a province within Moldova, a lady named Yevgenia Gutsul. She's in her late 30s, I believe, maybe early 40s. She was recently sentenced to 7 years in prison over, essentially, I believe it was, I think it was corruption as well as Russian funding, like overseas interventions into the election there. So election machinations, basically. It was similar to what the US Democrats tried to blame Trump for. So Yevgenia Gutsul is saying she's going to appeal her 7-year imprisonment decision. However, we have to keep in mind the Gagazian little ethnic enclave in Moldova. It's been essentially this tension point between Turkey. The Turks always have had these concerns for all the Muslims around the Black Sea, even those who aren't ethnically Turkic, like the Chechens, the Circassians, for example, in the past, Gagazians, Crimean Tatars, etc. They've always tried to be the big brothers and protecting all the interests of these smaller peoples. Now, they've also cared for the Gagazians in Moldova. However, it'll be interesting to see who stands up for Yevgenia Gutsul. Will it be the Russian Federation, who really should use the Gagazian influence in Moldova for future geopolitical measures? I mean, I don't have to emphasize the fact of how important Gaugazia is for Russian future interest in Odessa, in Pridnestrovia, Transnistria, in the future of Moldova, which is technically a province and oblast of the Russian Empire now that has somehow regained independence after the 1990s reign of Boris Yeltsin and the 1980s Gorbachev's regime. It'll be very important to see who exactly will stand up for the Gaugazian independence movement in Moldova, if that movement is even to come to fruition in some sort, right? Will it be the Russians? Will it be the Turks? I think this is an opportunity the Russians simply cannot pass up. Like we know, Transnistria, Pridnestrovia, for example, is a key land which, again, the Ukrainians have threatened to essentially annex and liberate from Russian influence, from Vadim Krasnoselsky, the based pro-Russian Empire Orthodox Christian president of Transnistria, Pridnestrovia, and Yevgenia Gutsul, now that she's being imprisoned. This is almost a regime change situation, really. And Kishinev is now, Moldova is not a NATO country, right, Conrad? But the president in Kishinev, Sandu, this female version of Zelensky, she's very much an enemy of Russia, even rhetorically speaking. She's fought against Russian culture. She's tried to essentially imprison bishops, or at least harass bishops over COVID restrictions. There's been all kinds of concerns coming out of Moldova. So Russian interests there again are being threatened, and hopefully Yevgenia Gutsul doesn't go to prison. I understand there's questions as to her funding. There's some sort of quasi-Moldovan Israeli oligarchs. It's very, none of these people have clean reputations. I mean, even the politicians sitting within the Kremlin, like, let's just be honest, they don't always have the cleanest connections. However, long-term thinking about Orthodox Christian interests in the region, it'll be very beneficial for Russia to stand behind the Gaugazians at this very clear time in history, especially when the Turkic world is uniting around Erdogan, around Aliyev. Russia should probably at least put its foot down and at least get involved, because Russia is, the Altai region, right, which is in southern Russia, North Kazakhstan, that is the homeland of the Turks, the Turkic peoples. Like, Russia is in some large part involved in the heartland of the Turkic peoples and their future in their history, frankly. So a lot of the lives of Russian saints involve many Turkic characters. So it's very important that Russia remains involved and doesn't really distance itself. I know it's very difficult to multitask these geopolitical foreign relations interests, but at the moment, we can see very clearly, Conrad, that as soon as you relax, the globalists who have their tentacles in almost every single country in that Southern Caucasus Turkic belt region will begin acting against you. So it's incredibly impressive how much pressure Russia has been able to handle, but more needs to be done. And one more thing I'd like to mention, it's quite clear, like we've seen Oleg Tsarev's real analysis of the Azeri-Armenian relations. Oleg Tsarev, mind you, was one of the main opponents of Poroshenko during he was actually almost imprisoned by the Poroshenko regime. Now he's currently sitting in Russia. He's one of the main pro-Russian Ukrainian politicians in exile, shall we say. Potentially in the future, if Russia ever takes a large portion of Ukraine, he may even, run for re-election in some of these Ukrainian regions, because he's literally, I believe he's from Dnipropetrovsk or Donetsk, one of these key cities. So he's actually if you can say, ethnic Ukrainian. He's literally from that particular people, he's from that tribe. So he's been active in that particular region throughout his whole life. However, keep in mind, here's a recent prediction about the Aliyev union with Pashinyan, with Donald J. Trump. He said that basically, and he's agreed with our prediction, Conrad. He said that it is not looking favorable for Russia. Russia's completely being pushed out of the Southern Caucasus region. This entire Trump bridge, Trump route, Zangezur corridor creation that they're putting together is only going to potentially create tensions futuristically. Like, it'll create a new pretext for Russia to commence war with Azerbaijan. Now, why would Russia ever invade or attack Azerbaijan, Conrad? Let's realistically look at it. What was the pretext for the SMO? It was the threat of NATO bases in Ukraine, or the threat of Ukraine joining NATO. Now, if Azerbaijan even in some way cooperates or seeks to join NATO in some way, I think this will absolutely trigger the people inside of the Kremlin, including President Putin himself, who's already felt the pressure of Sweden, Finland, and the Baltic states joining NATO, and the threats that Zelensky has been pushing this entire time. And I think, and of course the open request of Zelensky and even Moldova requesting to join NATO, I think this will push the situation over the edge. And you may even see a special military operation into Azerbaijan, into Baku, to prevent that from taking place. This was probably the crux of the argument of Oleg Tsarov, is that this entire agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan, in some ways, it is good that the bloodshed will end in this particular way, but it's not going to benefit long-term the Christians and even the Armenian Apostolic Christians living there. But of course, Eastern Orthodox Christians will be subjugated to this Turkic Talmudic regime, which I think in the end will force a NATO expansion to the northern areas of Iran. So this is closing that lid, of course, over the southern Caspian, over the southern Caspian, over that north region of Iran, and essentially entrapping Iran. We know in the south, in the Persian Gulf, there is the US fleet. In the north, you're going to have Azerbaijan, Armenia, which is now potentially going to be unfriendly towards Iran. You're going to have Turkey, and you're going to have a complacent, very quiet, maybe lukewarm Russia. So Iran is feeling the pressure at the moment. And of course, I think generally speaking, this will benefit not just the Freemasons who gathered in Baku, but it will benefit all the 500 plus rabbis who gathered in Baku this week as well, because again, their interests are for Iran to fall, for Iran to be turned into maybe like a quasi-Gulf state who simply supplies oil to various economies who request it, who supplies gas, essentially like a large gas and oil field, right, with no real sovereign power. And they want Iran to be subjugated so that Israel can further expand into Mesopotamia, and that greater Israel plan can be further worked upon, so that essentially the third temple can be built without any risks of foreign intervention in the near future.
Yeah, at this point, we're just going to be reporting. Be sure to follow us on the socials, on Twitter, on Telegram, so we can keep up with the latest developments on the Alaska summit. I'm sure there will be details worked out, things announced, more particular locations, who's going to be involved, all these other sorts of things. And now, I mean, everything on the battlefield is going to get a lot more in focus right now. People are going to start paying attention, I think, to the day-to-day, not just people like us that are these analysts, but I think the mainstream media is going to start paying more and more attention to the front line for this next week as this unfolds. But moving away from the Caucasus, Russia, Ukraine, we have to move to the other major war going on, the genocide in Gaza, as the latest Gaza annexation plan has been confirmed by the Israeli government, the IDF. Got this from antiwar.com from Dave DeCamp. Netanyahu confirms he plans full Israeli takeover of the Gaza Strip. The Israeli leader claimed he didn't want to keep Gaza, but the Israeli plans involve the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from large swaths of Gaza with the goal of driving them out entirely. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu confirmed in public comments on Thursday that his goal for Israel's next military offensive in Gaza is the takeover and full Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territory. Netanyahu claimed that he doesn't want to keep Gaza and that Israel would hand over the territory to an unspecified Arab force, but the Israeli military plans involve the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian civilian population of Gaza City and Gaza's central refugee camps with the goal of driving them out of the Strip entirely. We intend to control all of Gaza. We don't want to keep Gaza. We want a security perimeter. We want to hand Gaza over to Arab forces that will govern Gaza properly, Netanyahu told Fox News. In another interview, Netanyahu said Hamas and the Palestinian Authority couldn't govern Gaza and that the Israeli military would be responsible for overall security, meaning Israel would maintain a tight grip on the territory. We will never hand Gaza over to the Palestinian Authority or Hamas. We will provide overall security. There will be a security perimeter provided by us, he said. Netanyahu's plan has faced resistance from the military since heavy Israeli troop casualties are expected, and the Israeli captives in Gaza will likely be harmed or killed during the offensive. Thousands of Israelis are protesting against the planned escalation, and the families of the hostages are calling for a diplomatic deal to free their relatives. Despite the risks in the daily slaughter and starvation in Gaza, the Trump administration has decided to back whatever Netanyahu decides to do. President Trump has decided not to intervene and to let the Israeli government make its own decisions, Axios reported on Thursday. And of course, this comes in the past 24 hours. Israeli forces have killed 98 Palestinians in Gaza. At least 51 were killed while attempting to get aid. So everyone, it doesn't matter that all these countries are recognizing Palestine. It doesn't matter that Trump told them they need to stop, because why would they stop? He told them they could literally do whatever they want. So they're going to keep killing these people while they go to get aid. Smotrich is going to keep posing in front of graffiti that says "Death to Arabs" in illegal West Bank settlements. As those continue to expand, I believe settlers in the West Bank are storming and destroying the Christian monastery in Jericho. We're going to get to that in a little bit in the church persecution section later, but the Gaza situation is obviously escalating very negatively. And just to be particular on this operation, this is from Re'em Nevarim. The operation, apparently, of the latest Gaza annexation plan is in 3 phases. With phase 1, entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza City. Phase 2, the evacuation of the remaining Gaza City population, believed to be around 350,000. They will be relocated to Rafah, which is currently already under Israeli control. The deadline for phase 1 and phase 2 is October 7th. Phase 3, the final and military phase, will begin post-October 7th. Israeli forces will start with encircling the city, likely extending the entire way of the Netzarim corridor and advancing south along Al-Rashid Highway, which is located on the coast. Once a siege is imposed, Israel will begin ground maneuvers to take the city. So, very detailed and laid out description. There was a 10-hour cabinet meeting that occurred to basically knock out the details of this plan that finally got, because the chief of staff and many people were threatening to resign if the more extreme plan, which would have involved taking the entire strip and driving all the Palestinians out in a very short period of time. That was the original plan, but Netanyahu compromised with his cabinet leaders. I mean, apparently, I think Israel Katz was even against that full plan. So that shows you how genocidal Netanyahu himself really is and how far he is willing to go. And of course, we're hearing talks apparently that Trump is trying to get Somaliland recognized as soon as possible, break up Somalia. And unfortunately, I think that's entirely has to do with the fact they're going to put Palestinians there. They're trying to get that done as fast as possible so they can wrap up the Gaza war, get the West Bank annexed, and send as many Palestinians to northern Somalia, Somaliland as possible, which, I don't know, are we just getting another Houthi situation? We're going to now have 2 countries. We're going to have the Houthis, and then we're going to have Somaliland now occupied by 1.5 million Palestinians who are also going to develop missiles and start launching them at Israel. I guess from Israel's perspective, they're a few hundred miles farther away, so it was a victory generally speaking, but this is just absolutely insane. And I think Trump is really, really hoping, and maybe Trump is willing to give up more to Russia than we might assume, because he's really willing to try to secure, Armenia and Azerbaijan, Pashinyan and Aliyev are now joining the Thai and Cambodian leaders in nominating Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize. And I think if Trump can secure this Russia thing in some capacity, and even if, a lot of people maybe say he's cucking to the Russians, he gets the headline, Trump ends Russia-Ukraine war, he feels like he can sort of find himself justified for allowing the genocide in Gaza, the full destruction of Palestine, and, the full victory of Greater Israel, him facilitating that as, Zion Dawn. He feels that if he can facilitate these other peaceful endeavors, win this Nobel Peace Prize and end the war in Ukraine, maybe people will look past it. Maybe his legacy won't be as, the facilitator of a horrible, horrible genocide while being puppeteered by the people that killed Jesus Christ.
Absolutely, it's horrible. And Smotrich's office essentially is stating that he didn't know what that Hebrew graffiti was behind him on the wall when he was taking the photo. I mean, excuse me, it's almost like if that was in English and we were English-speaking standing there, we would clearly read that profane text. And it was very Talmudic, obviously, similar to the scribbles, the Talmudic graffiti drawn on the basement of the Paitsev house, where Tsar Nicholas II and his pious family was ritually murdered and martyred on the 17th of July, 1918. So it's very, very clear the Israelis have this knack of actually writing on walls next to the sites of where certain victims are slain. This is it's clearly a trend. And in a similar vein, Bezalel Smotrich actually, he's finally acting in a role of the finance minister and not this massive war hawk. He's almost like the foreign minister of Israeli affairs at this point. He's speaking more about war than actual financing. But he's made a following comment that he said that, look, we're actually looking to allocate $875 million to humanitarian aid for Gaza. And he said, it's not money for humanitarian aid per se, it's money for winning the war. Had we controlled the humanitarian aid to Gaza from the beginning, we would have won the war a while ago. So Smotrich's logic here is to use humanitarian aid as essentially a weapon, as a tool, even though there are people starving. Like, as he's discussing this aid, there are people starving and dying from basically nutritional needs and all kinds of diseases. Who knows? Imagine just the people in Gaza itself just breathing in the fumes from the explosives, the bombs, the debris. Who knows? I'm not sure if there's asbestos, if that was ever used in Gaza to build the cities and apartment buildings, but generally speaking, just breathing in the gas and the dust from all these explosives that have been dropped on these unfortunate people, it's probably going to cause immense health concerns in the future for all the population of Palestinians. It is a long-term genocide. I think we won't know the total death count until for years to come, similar to, for example, 9/11, right, which led to at least 5,000 to 10,000 people probably passing away from complications in years thereafter the event itself. So it's quite horrible, actually, what they're doing. And this new plan, obviously, to clear out Gaza City, I think this will lead inevitably to the depths of tens of thousands more Palestinians. Clearly, Israel has not collectively organized and a proper plan, and 10 hours sitting in a cabinet meeting sort of deciding upon this shows that it's really an act of desperation. It's like, okay, we're just going to sit here and decide. This hasn't been planned out before. This idea that we're going to we're going to create a humanitarian corridor into the south of the country, clear out the city of Gaza from civilians, 350,000+ people, which is more than, of course, in the Nagorno-Karabakh, as I said, 100,000 asylum seekers essentially left. Armenians left before the Azeris entered into that, right? This is more than that, 350 in essentially terrain which has been decimated by bombs. I mean, it's a huge convoy of people that are supposed to leave. Obviously, all of them will be searched. There'll probably be drones identifying them from the sky. There's going to be concerns that among these people, there'll be Hamas fighters, and clearly the only Palestinian resistance fighters left in Gaza City, so those who won't abandon their homes per se, theoretically, will be the Hamas, who, again, the Israelis will enter into the city and liquidate, according to their theory. But again, we know this won't probably eventuate in practice. There will be Palestinians who won't want to leave their homes, and who most likely will be affected by the ensuing carnage and bombardment. And again, Hamas has elected to, carry out the strategy of tactical urban guerrilla warfare in a similar way to the Chechens in Grozny. And, I'm somewhat judgmental over this particular tactic. Like, I understand the conditions under which they live, but it's very, shall we say, very Islamic of them. It's like this idea that you hide in tunnels under suburban and civilian infrastructure. Like, we saw the same in Chechnya, in some ways in Dagestan, in certain areas with the Chechens captured as well. But we have to understand that the Israelis are simply using this as a pretext to commit genocide. That's the number one thing, and they've said as much, right, openly. The influencers have said as much. You've seen Israeli IDF soldiers do similar things in Lebanon as well. Where they can, they will bomb Christian, various Islamic sites as well, because they want to annihilate as many people as possible. It's a very genocidal fervor which has taken over this people, unfortunately. And a recent Hamas statement, sort of in relation to this Gaza City expansion, they've clearly said that the Zionist entity's government is preparing to escalate its massacres in Gaza. We hold Arab governments in the West responsible for curbing this escalation. They've also said that the decision to occupy Gaza confirms that the criminal Netanyahu and his Nazi government do not care about the fate of their captives. They understand that expanding the aggression means sacrificing them, and by them they mean the captives and the hostages. So in some way, the Hamas do actually confirm that there are hostages. Some of those 20 hostages are in fact kept in Gaza City, somewhere on the ground, and that Israel will... Well, Hamas isn't threatening to kill the hostages per se, but they are stating that most likely the Israeli escalation and the fighting that will ensue on the ground in Gaza City will probably have some of those hostages killed as collateral damage. But very interesting that they call Netanyahu a Nazi. That's, again, a sort of very Cold War-esque rhetoric being used there. But generally speaking, all of this escalation is to further sort of congest the south of Gaza as well. So simply clearing out Gaza City won't be enough for them, Conrad. We know this is just one step in the direction that the Israelis want to push them at, because later on they will, of course, move these Palestinians somewhere else, possibly to the Sinai, where we know there's been massive refugee camps being constructed by the Egyptians. And they will say, well, we're going to need to cleanse and clean the south of Gaza as well, right? So they're going to essentially do the same what they're doing with Gaza City in other areas like Rafah, for example, which again they've been fighting in for a long time now. So it's very concerning. A lot of the Israeli official statements, we do read the headlines, but they are very hypocritical. They only tell you sort of one part of the story. It's very heavily framed from a very Zionist, shall we say, biased perspective. So all the news needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Like, these people have used the excuse of October 7th to massacre over 100, if not 200,000 people, and possibly even more, as I've said, from health, nutritional, and I would say disease-related complications for years to come. So maybe even 500,000 casualties will be the outcome of this particular war. So this is the unfortunate reality on the ground. And at the same time, Israel is pushing genocidal expansion in the West Bank, southern Lebanon, southwestern Syria as well. So we know that they're multitasking at the same time. This is simply one, maybe very key part of that puzzle.
Yes, and the Israelis are openly discussing starting a new sort of campaign against the Houthis, which we don't know what that would look like, likely an air campaign. So they are not holding back. They are not stopping their no-holds-barred expansive war in all directions to secure the realm that is Greater Israel to them. And one of the main fronts in this is Lebanon. And this is from Jason Ditz. Big developments here. Lebanon agrees to disarm Hezbollah, but U.S. plans hinges on Israeli compliance. After weeks of U.S. demands and conflicting narratives about what is actually being proposed, the Lebanese cabinet has accepted the U.S. proposal to fully disarm Hezbollah by year's end. Hezbollah's ministers, as well as other Shiites, walked out of the cabinet vote. The U.S. proposal, which is very recent, is starkly different from past U.S. demands. It sets a four-stage process whereby Lebanon's government establishes a full monopoly on all arms in the country by year's end. In return, Israel is to stop their near-daily attacks on Lebanon and withdraw from Lebanese territory. Just 2 weeks ago, the U.S. demand was a full disarmament of Hezbollah within 90 days, which would have put the deadline, which envoy Tom Barak said Israel established, in later November. At that time, Barak had insisted that the U.S. had no business asking Israel to stop attacking Lebanon. Now the deadline pushes through year's end and comes with conditions of Israel stopping their attacks and withdrawing in stages from the rest of southern Lebanon. Both these conditions were already established in November's ceasefire, though Israel never complied with either. Lebanese Information Minister Paul Marcos said the new agreement hinges on Israel actually living up to the commitments. It's not clear from current reporting if Israel agreed to this new deal in the first place, or if it was just a U.S. negotiating tactic and one they may or may not try to deliver on. Barak was perfectly comfortable to take credit for it, however, cheering the cabinet's compliance as historic, bold, and correct, and suggesting this amounted to Lebanon beginning fully implementing the November 2024 cessation of hostilities agreement. That agreement required Hezbollah to stop firing on Israel, withdraw north of the Litani River, and for Israel to stop attacking Lebanon and withdraw back to Israel. Hezbollah hasn't fired a single rocket at Israel since the ceasefire went into effect and has handed over a large number of sites south of the river, though Israel maintains that more still exist. By contrast, Israel's launched thousands of attacks on Lebanon and retains 5 military outputs built inside Lebanon after the pullout agreement was made. The ability of this Lebanese government to actually disarm Hezbollah despite the commitment remains to be seen. Hezbollah has repeatedly ruled out giving up their arms while Israel is actively attacking, and their reaction to this will hinge a lot on if Israel fulfills their side of the deal, a big if. Hezbollah is a substantial force and likely larger than Lebanon's own forces, so the ability of the army to impose disarmament remains to be seen. And in response to this, Naim Qassem, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, the replacement of Hassan Nasrallah, gave his first speech in a long time where he basically said that we reject this. The only path forward for Lebanon is unity among all of our parties against Israel. The Iranians said that they support Hezbollah's resistance to disarmament, and massive Shia protests all over the region occurred. You saw huge motorcycle convoys with Hezbollah flags mobilizing in Beirut and Tripoli and southern Lebanon, of course, where they have more of a presence. So this was obviously a huge development. I mean, there was even the mobilization of Lebanese military forces against some of these protests, hinting that there could be confrontations between the Lebanese military forces and Hezbollah Shiite groups. Again, the Maronites in particular have the strongest hatred for the Shiites, and they have a lot of control over the Lebanese armed forces. So we could be seeing a sort of soft Lebanese civil war, unfortunately, unfolding before our very eyes here. And again, why would we have any reason to think Israel would abide by any of this? They never abided by the first ceasefire. They never left Lebanon. They've been firing and striking and killing people all over the country. The only reason that it's being allowed to happen is because the people that currently run Lebanon ostensibly see the Israelis as doing their dirty work, killing their political enemies, the Shias, the Hezbollah party members, these sorts of things. So it's a total betrayal. These people are total Shabbos Goyim, and they are betraying Lebanon. Even if you do believe in the United Lebanese Project, you're betraying that for Israel right now because you have so much of a hatred for these Shia members of your own country. So it's a very unfortunate development, and I think we need to hope that I really don't know what you hope needs to happen, because Trump obviously is letting the Israelis do whatever they want here. Barak and the Lebanese government are going to hold Hezbollah to this agreement here. But the question is, I guess, will they hold Israel to anything when they inevitably violate the agreement? I think that remains to be seen.
Absolutely. And we just have to reiterate the point that Lebanon, after the bloody almost 10 years, a decade-long civil war, essentially divided its political power among the different religious factions within its ethnos. So it's the same ethnic people, but they are divided very strongly among the religious lines. So clearly you have the president, Joseph Aoun, who is a Maronite Christian. And so the president always has to be a Christian in Lebanon. This is according to their constitution. The prime minister, right, so the head of the parliament, Nawaf Salam, he has to be a Sunni Muslim, right? So Salam at the moment has united with Aoun, so both the prime minister, who is a Sunni Muslim, and the president, they've united on the idea that Hezbollah needs to disarm. Now, the one party that is in favor of Hezbollah is the Shia Muslim Nabih Berri. So Berri is the Speaker of the House in Lebanon. So essentially some people call him essentially the telephone man for Hezbollah. He's not officially a member of Hezbollah, but if anyone in the official Lebanese government wants to communicate with Hezbollah, they of course speak to Naim Qassem through the Speaker of the House, Berri. So it's very clear that he's very much on Hezbollah's side at the moment. He's made no clear statements for Hezbollah to disarm, so it's clear that it's 2 against 1 in terms of the official Lebanese politics and how it stands. However, keep in mind just total size of what are the arms like. We know Hezbollah is incredibly trained, very heavily motivated. They have up to, people estimate, between 40 to 50,000 members who are incredibly, of course, religiously as well as nationalistically motivated. The Lebanese official army has about 80,000 conscripts, and that's reservists as well, but you can imagine the motivation there is a lot less. The Lebanese Air Force is very weak compared to the Israeli Air Force, and clearly they won't pose a threat if a civil war breaks out in Lebanon between the official army and Hezbollah, because the Air Force is comprised of, I think, 10 attack helicopters, I believe, if that. And there's not a single fighter jet in the Lebanese Air Force. So clearly 10 helicopters won't pose much of a threat to Hezbollah, and we know that Hezbollah has been stockpiling missiles for a long time. And I mean, God forbid a civil war breaks out in Lebanon, because we know that there will be, of course, it will be drawn across religious lines. There'll be Christians killing Muslims, Muslims of various denominations killing one another. And of course, the only beneficiary out of all of this will be the Israelis, and who will most likely take all the land south of the Litani River and begin building military installations there, strongholds, etc. So it's going to be quite a nightmare. And I think the pressure on Aoun and Salam, Conrad, is coming from without. It's coming externally from Trump, from Netanyahu, from NATO, most likely. They're pressuring Lebanon to essentially stand down, to tell Naim Qassem, to tell Hezbollah to not essentially either disarm south of the Litani River entirely, or just not to be involved if the future war breaks out with Iran. And that's not really an if, it's when, right? So I think they're very happy that Hezbollah stood down during the 12-day war, and they don't want Hezbollah to cause any issues going forward. So very concerning. Nobody wants, and there are so many, the Lebanese diaspora is almost as big as the population in Lebanon itself. There are so many Lebanese folks living out in the West. That is because of that 10-year bloody national cross-religious civil war that took place. And again, the Israelis benefited so greatly from the civil war, then I think they'll be very happy if a new one breaks out. But unfortunately, Conrad, as you said, it's just that the official government, the prime minister, the president, they are beholden to Israel. They are beholden to Trump, to the West, to the globalists. And unfortunately, and I'm not saying Hezbollah are angels, but Hezbollah are clearly pro-Russian, they're pro-Iran, and the forces that be simply do not want a power. They don't want tens of thousands of militants who are vehemently anti-Zionist. They vehemently want to oppose the construction of the Third Temple. They don't want a force like that to exist anywhere near Israel. So that's what we're looking at up there in the north.
No, that's exactly the case. And it's not the only direction where Israel is still rapidly expanding. On August 6th, this is from Ram Navarm, an Israeli military incursion to southern Syria as Israeli troops advanced northeast of Barika. Israeli troops were likely reinforcing their position at an old Russian military observation in the Al-Quneitra countryside that was built during the Assad era, located just east of Birajam. So Israel continues to quite literally advance troop-wise into Syria, and all of this is occurring as As-Sueda, the Druze city that was clashing for so long with the quote-unquote Bedouin tribes, that still has yet to come under control of Damascus sources. They've officially cut all ties with Syria. The Supreme Legal Committee for Sueda has announced self-administration and the appointment of a commander for their security. The committee's page began its postings with a public statement which read, Sueda's government is going through a critical and pivotal stage due to the massacres and atrocities committed by government forces, the parentheses say general security of the Ministry of Defense, and the militias accompanying them. According to the statement, the spiritual leadership of a Druze community in Sueda has decided that the committee's tasks are 1. Managing Sueda's affairs across all sectors, administrative security and services, and in all areas of life. 2. Preserving public and private government institutions. And 3. Lifting injustice and harm off the shoulders of all citizens, regardless of their affiliations, and combating corruption. The statement noted that the goal of forming the committee is to establish an executive office in Sueda to manage service-related affairs, as well as to form specialized subcommittees for various situations. So obviously this is some form of balkanization. It is only one small town. I need to look up the exact population of Sueda, which is also probably hard to garner after all these, atrocities and evacuations and wars effectively have been ongoing there. But, Syria having a very hard time maintaining exactly the unity that they would like to. And of course, this comes amidst the SDF and the SNA Turkish-backed groups continue to clash. The SDF has yet to officially integrate. The latest statement here from Mazlum Kobain, the commander-in-chief of the SDF, he said, we demand the removal of the word Arab from the name Syrian Arab Republic, as Syria belongs to all components, not solely the Arab. They've been reinforcing their positions in the Diyarbakir direction and along the lines of control which they already possess. They do have 100,000 troops. That is what's been reported. And on Saturday, there were still clashes between them and the Turkish-backed factions, the strongest, most Turkish-backed factions within the Syrian National Army, the SNA, which still is sort of occupying the north of Syria on behalf of the Damascus government. So that is the situation in Syria, Lebanon, Syria. All these places have been completely destabilized on behalf of Israel for them to secure, their security and whatnot, which again, is what we are there for. We are enforcing all of that. We fund the SDF, which again, I'm not saying I support the HTS government at all, but the SDF not integrating obviously benefits Israel, keeping them distracted up there in the north with their Kurdish sort of lapdog there, which I think is going to become relevant in the coming weeks and months, especially with that development in the Zangezur corridor. We're going to talk a bit about the Jericho monastery situation later in the church news section. But Dimitri, unless you have anything else to say about Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, any other regional issues, Turkey, we're going to move on to talking about the U.S., Mexico, Venezuela. But I'd love to hear your final thoughts on the Levant.
No, it's very sad what's taking place in the greater Syria region. Of course, I feel for the Lebanese people because of the difficult decision-making that their politicians need to make, or even the people on the ground, prior to any further escalations from Israel taking place. Like, what do you do? Do you leave the country? Do you sell your home? Do you become an asylum seeker before the conflict even breaks out? It's these very hard decisions which are causing stress on this very ancient population that has lived here for literally thousands of years, going back to the Old Testament in the Bible. And it's just incredibly difficult for me to even put myself into their shoes. But just to mention about Syria, it's very interesting. It's not just the Christians and the Alawites and the Yazidi Druze that are being persecuted, but the Grand Mufti of Syria, Ahmad al-Hassoun, who apparently was so pro-Assad, now he's being tried in Syria. Most likely here, they're going to try and execute him, the HDS government. They're claiming that he was supportive of the Assad regime, and he's being put on trial by al-Jilani for crimes against the Syrian people. Mind you, his eldest son was actually killed a few weeks ago, actually, when he was leaving a mosque after Friday prayers, just shot dead on the street. So even the Grand Sunni Mufti, right, who doesn't belong to this Wahhabi Salafi sect in Syria, he's a very moderate Mufti. This is the leader of the local Muslims in Syria, has been, well, most likely will be executed according to some sort of degenerate Sharia Wahhabi principles in Syria. So my heart goes out to all the Syrian people, Muslim and Christian alike, because, I mean, what they're being put through on behest of Israel and whatever other dark powers are at play here, it's just very unfortunate. The Gulf states are entirely abusing the principles of so-called Islamic expansionism in order to push their own economic interests in the region. It's just very sad and dark. So it's, the war in mind sort of continues in this particular region. And unfortunately, I think Israel's aspirations for Lebanon, Conrad, will be very similar to that of Syria. They want land completely disarmed. Those 10 plus helicopters that Lebanon does have, they want Hezbollah to disappear. They want the helicopters to be brought down. They want the land to be essentially razed entirely, creating a wasteland similar to the Gaza Strip, which the Israelis can later populate as they rebuild it according to their own image.
Yeah, we're going to continue to watch the expansion of Greater Israel because, again, the expulsion of the Palestinians, where they're going to end up, the future of the West Bank are still very much in question here. And obviously, we know that Trump has effectively signed those away, but how that will effectively get worked out is yet to be seen. But a new front seems to sort of be emerging. This is a very big development that may have to become a more regular segment on the show. And this is the Mexican-South American narco front. And Kyle Anzalone has a good write-up sort of tying all of this stuff together that makes it efficient for us to understand here. Because again, everyone needs to listen to our recent episode on South America with Jose Nino. Very good timing here because, again, we're not Latin America, Spanish, South America experts here per se. I can always comment sort of on the immigration issue, the border and whatnot, which again has sort of been consistently locked down now since Trump has been in office, as I am in Texas myself, not far from the Mexican border. But as far as, actual cartel goings on and of course what's going on in South America itself, we are far from experts here. So be sure to check out our latest episode, or rather our second most recent Ether Hour episode with Jose Nino about South America. We talk about Venezuela, Argentina, Javier Milei, all that kind of stuff. But from Kyle Anzalone here, this is a good write-up. Trump authorizes military operations on foreign soil to target Latin American cartels. President Donald Trump has ordered the U.S. military to take direct action against Latin American cartels, including conducting operations on foreign soil. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has labeled Venezuelan President Maduro the leader of a cartel and is offering a $50 million reward for his capture. The New York Times reports President Trump has secretly signed a directive to the Pentagon to begin using military force against certain Latin American drug cartels that his administration has deemed terrorist organizations. The Times adds, the order provides an official basis for the possibility of direct military operations at sea and on foreign soil against cartels. Since President Donald Trump returned to the White House, the State and Treasury departments have listed several Latin American cartels as specially designated global terrorists. The targeted gangs include Tren de Aragua, Mara Salvatrucha, which is MS-13, and Cartel de Sinaloa. In July, Cartel de los Soles, Cartel of the Suns, was added to the list. On Thursday, Rubio explained that placing the cartels on the SDGT list allows the use of other elements of American power, intelligence agencies, the Department of Defense, whatever, to target these groups if we have an opportunity to do it. He added, we have to start treating them as armed terrorist organizations, not simply drug-dealing organizations. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has claimed Venezuelan President Maduro is the leader of Cartel de los Soles. On Thursday, he said the State Department was offering a $50 million bounty on Maduro. The State Department and Department of Justice are increasing the reward for the arrest of dictator Nicolas Maduro to $50 million for violating U.S. anti-narcotics laws, Rubio wrote on X. Maduro is the leader of the ruthless Los Soles cartel, a narco-terrorist organization that has taken over Venezuela. Maduro must be brought to justice. The Times report did not specify which countries might be targeted or what would happen if local troops resisted the foreign military operations on their soil. Blacklisted cartels are based in several Latin American countries, including Venezuela, El Salvador, and Mexico. The Mexican government rejected a proposal from Trump earlier this year that would have allowed the U.S. military to target cartels in Mexico. The Times notes the CIA is currently conducting surveillance flights over Mexico. Congress has not authorized Trump to attack cartels, so any military actions would be unconstitutional. However, the president and Congress have long ignored the constitutional process for war making. So, obviously, I think we could potentially see, drone strikes on certain cartel sites, especially, Tren de Aragua and the Sinaloa cartel. There are parts of Sinaloa, Mexico that haven't seen, non-cartel officials in years. They entirely run those areas openly. So, again, this is an interesting development. Obviously, there is some neocon support for this, but at the same time, Mexico is effectively a failed state, so I can't say I'm going to strongly condemn anything going on there, despite the protests of their Jewish president. As far as venezuela goes, the drug dealing stuff is likely based in some truth. I don't know if you could describe Maduro as the lead. I don't know, they think Maduro is sitting in these cartel, he's doing a Pablo Escobar himself. I don't know. They're trying to sort of frame him in this very gangster way so they can take him out, I guess. We know that ultimately when it comes to Venezuela, it's more about oil. It's more about the energy situation there because Venezuela has, 18% of the world's crude reserves. And of course, that's why the Guyana Essequibo situation is so relevant. We've talked about that a lot in the past. We talk about that in the episode with Jose. So be sure to check all of that out. But yeah, I think Mexico and Venezuela, and then because MS-13, El Salvador, but Bukele sort of has that on lock. I think they're really going to be focusing on Mexico and Venezuela here, Dimitri.
No, absolutely. It's really fascinating, especially since we've had so many like TV shows and movies about this region, almost as if the American public, Conrad, and those who watch or consume Hollywood Netflix goods have been essentially being prepared. Like even the Narcos TV show, which I think was a pretty decent, although very violent show, and definitely for adults, has been promoting this image of like the Americans need to go into Central America, they need to go into South America in order to deal with these criminals once, and it's very heroic. And it's not like I disagree with them. Like the drug trade is a real problem. Like the Russians have been dealing again, essentially trying to resolve it for a long time in their own regions. But for Central America, I think it's just it's being used as a scapegoat against Maduro in this case because of the oil, right? It's an energy consideration that first and foremost, I think, moves the Trump administration to make. Like Maduro has been in power for a long time. Trump really hasn't been a fan of him, but it's because if the Hormuz Straits are closed, the US will need a guaranteed supply of oil from some place in the world, right? Especially if the Middle East breaks down and oil shipments are interrupted. I think if Venezuela is in the pocket of America and there's an American-controlled regime running Venezuela, similar to Guyana, for example, like just a US-centric power, which gives the U.S. massive concessions on oil shipments and oil exports out of Venezuela to U.S.-led companies. I think what we'll see is Venezuela, I think, greatly will fall under the influence of America in the long term. I think the entire West as well will most likely rely on, maybe even the Chinese will come to, I know Maduro is very pro-China, but I think one of the biggest considerations will be whether or not the Chinese will greenlight what Trump's plan is for Maduro going forward. But yes, I agree. Maduro is not sitting in some basement like El Chapo or El Mayo, for example, planning some sort of drug trades. He's rich enough as it is. But keep in mind, $50 million American dollars for information leading to his arrest, Conrad. That's more than certain, I would say, Venezuelan Caracas-based generals would ever see, or their entire bloodlines have ever seen for hundreds of years going back to the conquistadors, right? It's an immense amount of money. This money could bribe Russian generals, let alone Venezuelan. Just so keep in mind, it's a huge threat. Like putting a hit on someone's head like this, it's very tempting for a general, a colonel, or someone in possession of military might that could, for example, arrest Maduro or open the gateway for Americans to take control of him or somehow to, shall we say, dispose of him, right? Even though it says leading up to his arrest, but we know what they really want to do to Maduro. This is a huge, I think, temptation for a lot of Venezuelans Venezuela is not the richest country, unfortunately, due to international sanctions, especially from Western countries. So I think that's always something we need to keep in mind. Bribery and corruption is always a threat to stability of sovereign nation states like Venezuela, Russia, and anyone, because the West, if it has one thing going for it, is the fact that it has a huge amount of money and capital saved up, which it can use as a tool to meet its geopolitical and economic interest ends around the world. But the other point I wanted to make, Conrad, is the fact that President Claudia Sheinbaum, right, our Jewish Mexican president down there, she's clearly openly stated that she agrees that Maduro is not a member of Sinaloa Cartel at all. He's not related to any cartels. And the Mexicans have been investigating this issue for a while. And she says that the U.S. simply doesn't understand. So she's essentially against this idea that America should be intervening in Mexican drug cartel dealings, that Mexico has to deal with its own problems. But keep in mind, realistically speaking, Sinaloa Cartel, I think it's responsible for something like 60% of all the drug trade, especially the fentanyl going through the American-Mexican border, which is huge. They're talking billions, $5 to $10 billion annually in drug trade, which is an immense amount of just garbage trash, which kills Americans going over that border. But also, the number of people Sinaloa Cartel has in its employment, it's just a little bit smaller. It's bigger than Hamas and just a little bit smaller than Hezbollah, and obviously probably bigger than the Wagner Group. So the Sinaloa Cartel has at least 25, maybe as much as 30,000 personnel in their employment, including probably trained and armed. Like we're talking, they're exactly the same with exactly the same gear and training as like the Wagner Group, Hezbollah, Hamas. So this is a battle group of its own south of the American border. We're not sure exactly who controls the Sinaloa Cartel behind the scenes. I wouldn't be surprised if there's, the usual suspects, just like with the East Coast American mafias, Conrad. Like you had these certain accountants in every single group behind Al Capone and all these other characters in the past. So I wouldn't be surprised if behind the Sinaloa Cartel you had these same dark dealers who, of course, make money from human trafficking, drug trafficking, causing mischief and all these evil deeds, related to essentially destroying the Christian population of America, and I think the Christian population of Central America as well. So at the end of the day, I think we just have to look at the realist angle, and that's Trump, this Monroe Doctrine, Trump expanding American interests and influence in case the world does become very segmented, segregated, and the multipolar world does emerge. America will very much be interested in what's happening south of its border in Central and South America, and this is just the beginning of that, interest expansion, similar to Trump's proposals earlier this year relating to Greenland.
No, I completely agree. And, a lot of other countries in South America are coming into play here. So we're probably going to have to follow up with Jose for another episode to analyze everything going on there. And of course, the China-BRICS connection is more relevant than ever. The whole situation in Brazil is escalating as the Supreme Court refuses to back down against Trump and Marco Rubio's pressure. Jair Bolsonaro is being persecuted there. I think they ultimately want to restore him to power. Eventually, the Americans do. So we're going to be following that situation closely as well. But speaking of multipolarity, the big economic situation in, Eurasia that has to do with, of course, the upcoming Alaska summit, the Russia-Ukraine war, the conflict with China. India is sort of getting caught in the middle here as one of Russia's biggest buyers of crude oil. They were buying from their shadow fleet more than anybody else. And supposedly there was a very tense 35-minute phone call between Trump and Indian Prime Minister Modi, which helped facilitate and escalate the tariff bomb. This is from the Times of India. A tense 35-minute call between Modi and Donald Trump in June may have lit the fuse in escalating U.S.-India trade war, says a Bloomberg report. Modi reportedly set the record straight on India's role in the ceasefire with Pakistan, warning Trump against legitimizing the Pakistani military by hosting Army Chief Munir at the White House. India rejected any suggestion of U.S. mediation, and Modi declined a visit to the White House. What followed, according to the report, was a clear shift. Trump began lashing out at India, ultimately imposing a brutal 50% tariff and calling India's economy dead. Could one call have broken a decade of strategic trust? This story reveals how a clash of egos, Pakistan's shadow, and a diplomatic rebuke may have derailed India-U.S. ties in real time. So, again, India has sort of been giving mixed signals on how they're going to respond to these potential sanctions and these tariffs. The question becomes is, as the week approaches with these negotiations with this Alaska summit, is that going to change? Obviously, I think it's probably going to get put on the back burner. And if things go well, I think the Indians may have dodged a bullet here. But that might have been, I think, a big part of why Trump felt. I mean, again, this could point multiple directions. Putin could have gotten scared, or Trump could have gotten spooked if he realized that India was actually going to go into the Russian-Chinese sphere of influence. If they threatened them like that, maybe Trump told Witkoff to give Putin a lot, tell Putin they're willing to give up a lot. And I think as we learn what that could be in the next week, and then on August 15th, as we see exactly how this future of a Ukraine and the future map in Eastern Europe is going to look like, I think, this is a very big deal. I think we're going to see exactly, who got pressured what, and maybe be able to decipher a little bit more of what was going on behind the scenes. Because, like you said, Dimitri, with Russia's industrial output, the reality of the Middle East situation, and potentially how everyone is communicating with China on secret back currents, all of this could factor into something that wouldn't necessarily be discernible to people just watching the surface level events. So unless you have anything else to say about Asia, I do have to talk about what's going on with Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. But China has also been escalating their patrols. They were sending boats in between the Taiwanese Channel. I'm forgetting the name of those Taiwanese islands that are to the south of Taiwan, but Chinese Coast Guard ships were coasting through there, which apparently is a very rare incursion. The Chinese don't usually take that route. So they continue to escalate in their advances onto Taiwanese territorial waters as the ROC, Taiwan, continues to get weapons and escalate their sort of open separatism and resistance to Chinese integration and cozy up to the United States.
No, very interesting. And speaking about the Balkans, right? Always very interesting news coming out of there, especially in relation to, the European interaction with Russia and sort of pro-Russian states. We have to mention Republika Srpska, one of our most interesting places, I think, that we discussed. And it's been escalating. It's been cooking, sort of slow cooking, slow boiling over time. And finally, it's reached a certain crescendo with Dodik, the leader, the president of Republika Srpska, is a local autonomous president. And now the European Central Electoral Commission has decided that he is no longer the president of Republika Srpska. They've decided to apply the law which lays down that an elected official is automatically forced out of office if he is sentenced to more than 6 months in jail. So it's very interesting that This particular character, so Dodik has been active in Republika Srpska politics for decades now. He knows the region, he knows the people. He's actually, I think, saved Serbian autonomy in Bosnia-Herzegovina, because you have to keep in mind there was Serbian autonomy in Croatia as well, until, of course, events during the 1990s, which led to a huge Serbian exodus out of Croatia. And unfortunately, the Serbian autonomy there is almost entirely lost. The diaspora really doesn't exist in any meaningful way, but Bosnia-Herzegovina is very different. So Dodik has openly stated on social media that he does not care what the Central Electoral Commission has to say, really, in Republika Srpska, and what the European Union actually comments. Dodik said that he rejected the court ruling and that it's unconstitutional and politically motivated. He said that the people have voted for him. Surrender and giving up do not exist. Surrender is not an option, he wrote on his X post. Very clear, Dodik is of the same mind that, just like in Romania when the election was stolen in December, whatever you do as an elected politician, you have to fight until the end. Like, especially if there's a potential political sentence awaiting for him. Unfortunately, as we saw in the 1990s and early 2000s, if you're a right-wing politician from the Balkans and there's they're coming to arrest you, unfortunately, you won't really have many allies. The Greeks won't stand up to you. The Romanians won't. The Russians certainly will not. Unfortunately, they're not strong or influential enough to really come and assist you in this particular factor. And Dodik doesn't want to become an exiled politician in Russia, Conrad. I believe he wants to stay with his people. He doesn't want to become a Dr. Assad or a former president of Ukraine, for example, who's been ousted by Maidan. He wants to remain in charge, and I think he's here to fight the long battle. And he actually has lawyers acting for him who are continuing to try and appeal with the Constitutional Court of Bosnia-Herzegovina. So it'd be very interesting to see exactly how this pans out, and especially if, Dodik's closest neighbors, that is Alexander Vučić, or the Hungarian neighbor, the famous Prime Minister of Hungary, if he actually stands up and supports Dodik. I think this was, because you have to keep in mind, Bosnia-Herzegovina historically, as much as it has been, of course, a part of Serbia, it has also been a crucial part of Hungary. Like during the 13, 14, and 1500s, when the Kingdom of Hungary was at its strongest and for fighting against the Ottoman Empire, like tooth, nail, and claw, until the very end, Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Serbs of Bosnia-Herzegovina, united with the Hungarians to create a powerful knightly force, and they had a really powerful army. Together, they worked against the Ottoman expansion in the Balkans and in the region itself, especially when large parts of Kosovo, Serbia were captured by the Ottomans. So this particular alliance between Serbs, Hungarians, it has existed in the past, and I think there's certainly a lot that can be said. And I think, looking at the example of Romania, Conrad, Dodik is simply not willing to give up the future of his maybe political aspirations. I'm not saying he's not an egocentrical character. Potentially he is, but looking into the future, he is a potential player. He's spoken out in favor of Orthodoxy as well in the past. He's someone who could benefit, I think, the Orthodox as well as the Slavic world in Eastern Europe. There's no reason why we, for example, shouldn't support him. So Milorad Dodik, I hope he remains steadfast, and I hope he has bodyguards and people who can protect him against, any sort of forced arrests.
No, I agree. We got to pray for Dodik. I hope he, it's unfortunate that, he's forced to be an ally of Israel, but you got to cut him some slack. It's a whole Muslim Christian situation over there. There's even been some news about the Turks wanting to support Bosnia and Herzegovina and Sarajevo here, and the Russians. A lot of the prophecies do say that things will stem from the Balkans, so we are always keeping an eye on that. Of course, the big announcement, the United Nations called on all parties to cooperate in order to uphold the rule of law amid the situation involving Republika Srpska. President Milorad Dodik, the UN Deputy Secretary General's representative, said. And at the same time, Bosnian media report that Republic of Srpska President Milorad Dodik met in Montenegro with U.S. Presidential Envoy for Special Missions Richard Grenell amid the escalating Bosnia crisis after Dodik's verdict. So this is the type of thing I think that you get for being an ally of Israel. Dodik can still go to a neutral country, meet with a U.S. official who, of course, loves Jews himself, and sort of get treated with respect. So in many ways, this is why you sort of play the Israel game. But we got to hope that, Republika Srpska can maintain its autonomy, and we can hope that the Serbs there continue to, I think, grow their influence and hopefully eventually regain access to the sea in some official capacity, like with regaining Montenegro or something like that. Because ever since 1990, it's just been an unfortunate, anti-Orthodox crusade from the West against, the Orthodox ruling people of that region. Let's be perfectly honest here. But we have to move on to talking about church persecution. And the biggest church persecution news recently, of course, is coming out of the Holy Land. If you followed me on X, you saw my post recently. I was quote tweeting Andrew Cusack, who is He's some, member of the Malta Knights of St. John, which is that sort of country. You can become a member of that country that's not really a country. It's, this sort of thing. It has all these embassies, the Knights of Malta. I'm sure people have heard of it. But he reports this, just got off the phone with Jerusalem. Today, the municipality of Jerusalem froze all bank accounts with the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate. He means the Jerusalem Patriarchate. The city is attempting to impose and backdate property tax on religious sites, from which properties used for religious purposes have always been exempt. The Patriarchate now has no access to any form of payment for anything. They were in talks to find a solution with the municipality, who had promised to not act unilaterally in the meantime. Instead, this is what happened. So we have to pray for the church there. Huge developments, obviously. I've yet to see any official response from the church. They're, I'm sure, trying to negotiate with the Israelis, not come out with some kind of big statement to cause them to retaliate further. But, at a certain level, we need to start calling on our Christian allies here. And it's very unfortunate that Russia, continues. And again, the Jerusalem Patriarchate, yes, they are Greek, but they're on the old calendar. They've always maintained communion with ROKOR, these other groups. It's unfortunate that the Russians don't prioritize protecting the Orthodox as opposed to wanting to cozy up to Netanyahu, but they see that as a geopolitical necessity. But the other piece of persecution coming out of Palestine is the situation in the West Bank. This is from KT Greece. Israeli settlers expand land encroachment of St. Gerasimos Monastery. Greek authorities have expressed deep concern over reports of expanded land encroachments by Israeli settlers on property belonging to the Greek Orthodox Church. They mean the Jerusalem Patriarchate in the West Bank, particularly around the historic monastery of St. Gerasimos of the Jordan near Jericho. According to an exclusive report by Daily Kathemerini, the settlers' actions involve the extension of illegal settlement and activity on land under the jurisdiction of Jerusalem Patriarchate. The monastery, founded in the 5th century by St. Gerasimos and located north of the Dead Sea, includes sections dating back to the 9th and 12th centuries. The modern monastery of St. Gerasimos is an oasis in the Judean desert, and it stands 3.5 kilometers west of the Jordan and close to 6 kilometers north of the Dead Sea in a semi-arid plain once known as the Desert of the Jordan. Apart from the Jordan River, the only perennial water source of 4 springs, the largest and closest one being Ain Hajla. As of 1979, the date orchards belonging to the monastery were irrigated by waters from here. Greek-Israeli tensions over Orthodox Church properties have reportedly surfaced multiple times in recent years. The pressure on the Jericho region has intensified in the past 2 years, particularly following the October 7th, 2023 Hamas attack and the subsequent war on Gaza. At least 5 new settler outposts have reportedly been established near Jericho, often preceding further land seizures. There have been reports that settlers have actually even stormed this monastery itself recently. So I know Father Spiridon was posting about that and others. So we have to pray for the situation there. We talked about Taipei, the last majority Christian or exclusively Christian town in the West Bank, being assaulted and attacked by Israeli settlers. Obviously, the churches in Gaza continue to be struck and the areas near them are attacked. I'm wondering how they're going to fare amidst this Gaza City annexation. Effectively, they're going to be asked to leave. All the Christians at St. Porphyrios, all the Christians at Holy Family Catholic Church are going to be asked to leave Gaza City. That seems to be what's going to happen. And that should be unacceptable to any country that claims to be remotely Christian. But here we are. And the other big story from this region regarding, monasteries and whatnot is the Mount Sinai situation about St. Catherine's Monastery. And this is from Ortho Christian. Egyptian Foreign Minister announces agreement on St. Catherine's Monastery. Egyptian Foreign Minister Badel Abdelati announced during his official visit to Athens that Egypt and the Monastery of St. Catherine will soon sign an agreement, with Greece present as a witness, expressing his assessment that there is absolute understanding about the developments on this issue. The Egyptian Foreign Minister provided assurance that Egypt will not deviate from its commitments to St. Catherine's Monastery, emphasizing that President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's instructions are to further strengthen Egyptian-Greek relations. With the historic and religious weight that the monastery carries, it cannot be anything but a bridge of understanding between our two countries, he said. Abdelati reiterated that President Sisi's position that the monastery's status is sacred and untouchable, expressing bewilderment at what he called malicious rumors circulating about the monastery's future. I want to assure you that these are unfounded and baseless. No one can touch this monastery, which holds special spiritual weight for history. We completely reject any action that harms the monastery, he stated. We promise that the monastery will continue to play its historic role as a bridge between the two countries, noting that Egypt's historical commitments to religious sites are unwavering and describing such sites as a heritage we are pleased to have in our territory. For his part, Greek Foreign Minister Gera Petridis expressed appreciation for the sensitivity shown by President Sisi and the efforts of both the President and Foreign Minister regarding the monastery on Mount Sinai. So, this is a good development. The monastery's monks had closed its doors to visitors in protest, and the Greek government had engaged in intensive diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis. The dispute was further complicated by Egypt's ongoing Great Transfiguration tourism development project in this area, which critics feared could threaten the monastery's sacred character and autonomy. So this is obviously a very positive development. I don't know how this is going to impact the sort of internal dispute between the monks and the archbishop/abbot, but this is obviously, I think, an objectively good thing, and we can hope that this stays. But if you have any updates on other church persecutions, Dimitri, specifically in Ukraine, I think we would love to hear it.
Yeah, certainly. Ukrainians have begun releasing very humiliating, I would say embarrassing footage, but not for, of course, the people in the footage itself, but by the people releasing them. So sin has been committed once again. The Ukrainians are releasing footage of Metropolitan Jonathan Yeletskich. Remember, this is the Metropolitan who was in prison, one of the first, I think, bishops of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the canonical one who was put into prison. He had a stroke. If you recall, in prison, he was greatly abused, and he was, I believe he was in prison for at least a year and a half before Patriarch Kirill personally organized for him to be exchanged, I believe, and now he's recovering in Moscow. So they're releasing video clips, Conrad, of him being questioned, interrogated inside of a van, and the Ukrainian asking him the question in Russian is basically like, well, do you think it's okay for Russians to kill? And all these bizarre quasi-biblical, strange theological questions. Is trying to get the Metropolitan, who just suffered a stroke, by the way, to answer and say something embarrassing for himself. This 5-minute video is incredibly abusive, and whatever the Metropolitan, whatever mistakes he may have made in his statements, it's completely irrelevant. The man was clearly either taken out of detention just that morning. He looked very unkempt, looked very confused, and obviously releasing such interrogation footage to try and attack an Orthodox Christian bishop, that is one of the most accursed things you can probably do beyond simply imprisoning a bishop in the first place, correct? So it's literally a confessor of the faith being interrogated. This is the Bolshevik-style work here from the Ukrainians. And of course, we all pray for Metropolitan Jonathan, and we're grateful that he's finally free and liberated from being inside of a Ukrainian jail. So one of probably the best things that Patriarch Kirill has actually done in recent years in terms of advocating for the confessors and martyrs in Ukraine. So that's very, very good. We recently also received, Conrad, in relation to the UOC and the OCU, of course, the non-canonical OCU relations, an interesting statement from Archimandrite Kirill Gavarun, and he was excommunicated by the Russian Church. He was an Archimandrite of, I think, the Russian diocese somewhere in Finland or Sweden. He was like basically this trendy Andrei Kuraev type Archimandrite who would always make video clips, and he was a hardcore liberal. Eventually, Patriarch Kirill excommunicated him and defrocked him. He still calls himself an Archimandrite, so he makes these videos and he's very pro-Ukrainian, but he recently stated that he had internal sources that Metropolitan Onufry apparently passed this secret signal at the beginning of the SMO to all the canonical clergymen inside the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to begin growing out their beards and make them very long, so that you can differentiate between the trendy OCU trimmed beard types, Archbishop Elfidofora style, lining up their beards and mustaches, with the canonical bishops who have these long, luscious beards and, grand mustaches and whatnot. So very interesting revelation from former Archimandrite Kirill Gavarun. And I think it's somewhat correct, because you do see it clearly, not just a physiognomy difference, but clearly the facial hair between the canonical clergymen as well as the uncanonical schismatics is very, very obvious to see. So, I mean, that's amazing. And just wanted to comment on the St. Gerasimus Monastery, because I actually had the pleasure of visiting it back when I made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land with my family. And we actually accidentally, there's so many Israeli military bases next to that monastery, Conrad, that it's surprising that the police or the Israeli military didn't stand up for the local Greek monks and the Palestinian monks who had their private property treaded upon by these settlers. So clearly the army or the police is working together with the settlers, because I remember I accidentally turned my car into an Israeli military encampment because I thought that was the monastery. They all look very similar, very similar high fences. And I was like, oh, okay, we'll just reverse out of here, continue down the road north of the Dead Sea. It's a very interesting sort of anecdotal account, but it shows you very clearly that when these settlers armed with pistols, assault rifles, enter into your land, in these West Bank zones, and you call the Israeli police, they simply will not turn up. Your property rights, your private property rights, whether you're a clergyman, a monastic, a layperson, Palestinian, Greek, or whatnot, will not be respected if this Zionist settlers are treading upon your particular property. So it's very clear. And, it's very, speaking of a sort of property being seized and dispatched of, we have sort of more news that the Pachayev Lavra has become again a target in Western Ukraine. The Pachayev Orthodox Christians, this is the biggest monastery next to Lvov in Western Ukraine, something that most likely this Orthodox Christian land will remain in Ukrainian occupation for a long time, even if this ceasefire treaty goes ahead. But the Pachayev Lavra has a very important miracle working icon, the Pachayev Theotokos, which, there's a lot of people attesting to its healing. For the Theotokos heals through the icon, and many demons are exorcised from it. The Pachayev Lavra is famous for its multiplicity of cases of exorcisms. Generally speaking, the monks of this monastery, as well as the lay people, had organized massive processions to show that the Orthodox Christians, they support the monastery. They don't want the Ukrainian authorities to infiltrate this monastery at all. For the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine, led by Zelensky and his Talmudic gang in Kiev, to take the monastery. So it's very clear the Orthodox Christians are signaling, look, we will not allow what happened to the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra to happen to the Pachayev Lavra out in the west, no matter, even though it's very far away from the Russian borders and almost, you can say, unprotected by any military action. The Russians are very far from liberating or annexing that land. So it's very clear that's exactly what's happening. And last week, very interestingly enough, we did read about the case of Patriarch Bartholomew making his weird ecumenist statement. And we sort of condemned it in short form because, again, weird quasi-ecumenist statements about, sacred religious traditions among all faiths really should be rejected outright. There's no real room to sort of speak about all this. Metropolitan Panteleimon, actually, of the Alexandrian Orthodox Church. So I suppose I'm surprised to see that the Alexandrian Orthodox Church, mainly under Patriarch Theodoros, the Pope of Africa and Alexandria recently, has been very pro-Ukrainian and, shall we say, pro-Bartholomew. But this particular metropolitan from the Alexandrian Church has openly, essentially condemned Patriarch Bartholomew's speech. He said that there were contradictions in it. There were sort of prerequisites in the speech of Patriarch Bartholomew to, essentially religious dialogue going forward, which may encompass ecumenism. And so he basically called it purely ecumenist, heretical, and delusional, all of those positions proposed by Patriarch Bartholomew, which is really strong for a Metropolitan Panteleimon to be saying that. I mean, he could be chastised and, he could be told off by his leader, Patriarch Theodoros of Alexandria. But so we have to pray for Metropolitan Panteleimon. Clearly, not all the higher clergymen of the Alexandrian Orthodox Church have these, shall we say, left-wing, maybe pro-Western positions. And, it's really good. I'm hoping that in the future, more hierarchs of the Alexandrian local church come out as one of the most ancient churches. Clearly, it's always been ranked very high in the diptychs for a good reason. So this is very heartwarming to see someone from that local church actually come out and speak openly. And I have a bit of some good news, actually, a very positive news coming out from Anapa, from the Kerch. So the Kerch Straits, as you know, on the right side, you have the Krasnodarskaya Oblast. So there was that recent oil spill that took place in the Sea of Azov, Black Sea entrance. And that oil spill, obviously, people were cleaning up the oil and debris along the coastlines, and they identified an ancient icon, a big icon of a Theotokos, about 60 centimeters by, I think, 70, 80 centimeters. So quite large, made out of wood. Yeah, the paint is slightly scratched off on certain parts of the icon, but it's clearly the Theotokos holding the infant Christ. The icon looks very old, at least a few hundred years old, and no one knows really. I mean, it's been given to professional restorationists to sort of identify it exactly. It has some writing on the back. I couldn't tell if it was Church Slavonic or Greek, but this is almost goes back to like the iconoclast era, Orthodox Christian saints who would, place icons into the water and they would float to Mount Athos. So, the Iveron icon, for example, you read about these holy miracles, and for the Orthodox Christian Russians in the Krasnodar Oblast in Anapa to find an Orthodox Theotokos icon just on the beach is incredible. And for it to somehow survive the salt water and the deterioration is incredible. Hopefully it can be fully restored and we can identify exactly. And if we don't identify what it is, I'm sure it'll be a local very venerated icon and really a way for us to connect to the Holy Theotokos and the Holy Trinity. So this is, again, one of the, the good news. There's a lot of great miracles we don't necessarily always speak about on the show, but this is just one of them that, and, Anapa, Krasnodar, these are places where, these pious Russian Orthodox Christians who found the icon, they were cleaning up the debris on the beaches voluntarily. They weren't being paid for it. This is simply their land, and the oil spill caused huge havoc, killed a lot of wildlife, flora, fauna, and they were simply cleaning it. They found an Orthodox Christian icon, and they were always in danger from Ukrainian drones, these water drones, and all kinds of other, these are prime targets of terrorist activity here in the Krasnodarska Oblast. So what a huge blessing for the Russian Christians living on the coastline there.
No, those are always wonderful occurrences. It's always good to rediscover. Again, there's still ostensibly letters of Paul that could be rediscovered. There's a whole discussion about how that would factor into, the canon and this sorts of thing. But, there are so many things that our tradition could still ostensibly show us from what the Holy Spirit could reveal to us could be very wonderful. But I'm glad you mentioned Metropolitan Panteleimon, of course, a retired metropolitan of the Alexandrian Patriarchate, really showing the importance of retired hierarchs still maintaining their voice. They're able to speak more strongly because they are no longer, in their position of power. So if they, face the backlash of the establishment, as it were, it's a bit easier for them. So it's important for these retired hierarchs. I know there's many in Greece that do the same thing. So these are important voices. But yes, it was the Patriarch Bartholomew's speech, which was called Contradictions and Prerequisites of Interreligious Dialogue. And he was talking all about having a common sacred worldview and a framework described as the sacred itself, the ultimate absolute reality, which is expressed in various ways as God, Allah, Brahman, or the luminous void. This is what Patriarch Bartholomew said. He emphasized that the encounter of the different religious traditions, each one a bearer of a unique experience of the sacred, becomes the necessary condition for the confrontation with a globalized meaninglessness. He argued for religions to work together based on shared values of love, compassion, mercy, forgiveness, and self-sacrifice. At the same time, the Patriarch stated that this framework was not an attempt to create a new syncretistic religion, and that each tradition should preserve its distinct identity. He called for religions to find common ground against what he termed materialistic reductionism, to form a global alliance of conscience. Metropolitan Panteleimon firmly rejects this approach, asserting the Orthodox traditional position that there are not many gods, but one is God, the creator of heaven and earth, and all that is contained within them. The Metropolitan declares that neither Allah nor Brahma nor Buddha are gods, calling them creations of human thought or human organisms and philosophical systems. He cites the prophet David, noting that Scripture clearly names the gods of the nations as demons. There's no other God, except only the Holy Trinity, the Father and the Son and the All-Holy Spirit, Metropolitan Panteleimon states, emphasizing that all the holy apostles and fathers of the Orthodox Church confessed and proclaimed this God. Metropolitan Panteleimon concludes his statement by calling for prayers for the patriarchs, metropolitans, abbots, priests, hieromonks, and faithful Christians who have been swept up in the delusions of ecumenism, so that they may rightly divide the word of the holy faith of the Orthodox, which preserves the truth. Metropolitan Panteleimon has also condemned Constantinople's creation of the schismatic Orthodox Church in Ukraine and its recognition by the Patriarch of Alexandria and others. So this guy's a total hero. If you look at his picture on Ortho Christian, he looks like a total Giga Chad, so no surprise there. But you mentioned St. Gerasimos Monastery, Dimitri, as well, and that reminds me, it's right next to the Dead Sea. Makes me think of St. Paisios' prophecy about Israel, in the 80-year curse about how the Dead Sea will be their tomb. And I'm thinking if these people start to get too aggressive on this monastery here, maybe some of them will literally be thrown into the salty sea. But final news I have from Ukraine here, and this is also from Ortho Christian. The Zaporia Diocese of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has issued a stern appeal to territorial recruitment centers regarding the forced mobilization of clergy, warning that compelling priests to military service constitutes an assault on the church as a spiritual institution. The appeal, published on August 4th, signed by His Eminence Metropolitan Luke of Zaporia and Melitopol, and the faithful of the Zaporia Diocese of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the people of Ukraine, declares that forcing clergy to mobilization is not simply a violation of their rights. This is an attempt to behead parishes. This is an attack on the church itself as a spiritual organism, the body of Christ. The appeal comes as Ukraine has increasingly turned to forcibly mobilizing clergy of the canonical UOC in recent months. The Union of Orthodox Journalists has reported on 4 separate instances of clergy detainment by territorial recruitment centers just in the past week of August. One priest was taken away while on his way to confess and commune a seriously ill parishioner who was instead left without pastoral care due to the actions of the authorities. In the statement, the Metropolitan emphasizes the unique spiritual bond between priests and their congregations, stating a pastor is not an official or hired worker. He's connected to his flock through the Eucharist, confession, baptism, prayer. It's impossible to replace him, just as you can't grow a tree in one day after cutting down an old one. His Eminence later warned recruitment officials that mobilizing priests would deprive entire communities of spiritual services. By taking away priests from the community, you deprive hundreds and sometimes thousands of people of their connection with the church, with God. This is depriving people of confession, communion, baptism, funeral rites, he writes. Metropolitan Luke stresses that Orthodox priests take vows to God rather than secular authorities, making military service canonically impossible. A priest gives an oath not to the authorities but to God, and this oath is forever, he states. According to the canons, a clergyman is forbidden to take up arms and make a worldly oath, i.e. to swear allegiance to anyone else, even the state. Obviously, he's not talking about people that become chaplains, but these people aren't getting forcibly recruited to be chaplains. They're getting forcibly recruited to go and die on the front lines. So Metropolitan Luke, he goes on to predict that removing priests won't lead communities to join the schismatics, as some might expect, but instead will drive believers into the shadows, into internal isolation, with resentment towards those who created spiritual problems for them, which is most definitely true. So obviously Metropolitan Luke always standing strong, but we've known about this forced mobilization thing for a very long time, and it's a very unfortunate development. But unless you have anything else to say, Dimitri, on that or any other church news, it's probably time we start landing this plane if you want to give us any final words.
No, it's been a very eventful week. Our episodes, seemingly as the news cycle gets more extended, the episodes of World War Now are getting much longer. So thank you for sticking with us until the very end. Very important news to cover, especially if you follow it week to week. And if you even listen on 1.5 speed as you do your chores, certainly very good, I want to say, healthy coverage of the world and geopolitics from a very Orthodox Christian perspective as we cover essentially the Third World War as it's happening right now, without the additional anxiety and reading all the evilly and I think maliciously framed headlines, which me and Conrad have to digest in due course throughout the week as we prepare for the episodes. In any case, keep us please in your prayers as we prepare for any future interviews and episodes. We have a lot of great content coming out for you. As you've seen, our recent Aether Hours have been quite diverse, and so we do need to prepare for all of these. So thank you again for your support. The best way to support us would be to subscribe on Substack and receive, again, hundreds of hours of special episodes from us, as well as book chapters and other great projects that we're working on. There's a lot of exciting stuff coming up. Definitely check out the Q&A thread, which will come out very soon. And keep in mind, when the Q&A thread drops on Substack, and check your emails, you may see the link there, you will have maybe as short as a week to lodge your questions, okay, before we release the Substack Q&A 8th hour episode. So keep that in mind. So definitely do not delay with your questions, right? Put it into the thread and we will answer them on the special Q&A episode coming up in the near future. Thank you, everyone, again for your support.
Yeah, that thread's going to be dropping very soon. And of course, where you can get access to that, where you can get behind the paywall is worldwarnow.co. That is our home base. You get behind that paywall $7 a month or $75 a year. A little bit cheaper. You get access, again, not just to these Q&A threads that we try to do on a monthly basis. You get access to multiple premium Discord channels within our server where you can talk to us more frequently. You also get access to the hundreds and hundreds of hours of Aether Hour content, including this week's Aether Hour episode with Ryan Dawson, where we go into more and more details specifically about the Trump-Epstein connection, Ghislaine Maxwell and what's going to happen with her, and just in general, the current state of our Israeli blackmail-occupied government. So really great episode, going to be linked down below. You also get our Jose Nino episode. Totally got that. Hundreds and hundreds of hours of other episodes, interviews with Father Peter Heers, interviews with Father John Whiteford, interviews with Abbot Trefon, interviews with Cameron McGregor, all sorts of incredible people, a lot of forthcoming interviews as well. We've got a lot of big things planned, so get behind that paywall. It supports the show. Be sure to check out my weekly streams, World War Live. I'm streaming on Substack now as well, so every Tuesday evening I'm going to be live on Substack, X, and YouTube. So subscribe to us on YouTube, put notifications on, get access to all of that. If you're on Substack, you can watch there as well. You'll get notifications for all my streams. Follow us on X at @WorldWarNow_. We're getting more and more followers on there. Really great news source. Follow us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. Be sure to also follow me on X at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at WWN Host. Again, Substack, worldwarnow.co. That's our home base. That's where you can really support us. And if you want to send a super chat and ask me a question on my Tuesday evening live streams, we can do that as well. So keep an eye out for that Q&A thread. Keep an eye out for all of our future episodes, Aether Hours this week, and we will see you on the next one. God bless.